Tonight, we tell a story not just of a great general, but of a man whose name would echo through the halls of Rome as the embodiment of its deepest fears. A man who became the living definition of terror for the most powerful republic the world had yet seen. This is the story of Hannibal Barca. His life was the flashpoint of a great conflict, one destined to erupt in the world he inherited, a world dominated by two colossal powers, whose struggle would define the future of Western civilization. 2 centuries before the birth of Christ, the Mediterranean Sea was a chessboard for empires. And on this board, 2 players moved with unstoppable ambition. To the south, on the coast of modern-day Tunisia, lay the shimmering city of Carthage. It was a jewel of the ancient world, protected by massive triple-layered walls and boasting one of history's great engineering marvels. Its circular military harbor, the Cathan, capable of hiding over 200 warships from sight. Carthage was not a capital born of conquest, but of commerce. Founded by the Phoenicians, a legendary people of sailors and merchants from the Levant, it was the heart of a vast trading empire. Its pulse beat not with the rhythm of marching armies, but with the constant traffic of ships laden with tin from Britain, silver from Spain, and spices from the east. The Carthaginians, known to the Romans as the Punics, a name derived from Phoenician, were masters of the sea. Their power was built on a concept the ancient Greeks called a thalassocracy, an empire of the sea. They did not hunger for vast swathes of farmland. Instead, they controlled key islands and coastal ports: Sicily, Sardinia, the shores of Spain. These were strategic trading posts, pearls on a string that stretched across the entire Western Mediterranean. Their government reflected their nature. Carthage was an oligarchy, a republic ruled by its wealthiest merchant families. For them, the bottom line of a balance sheet was often more important than the glory of a battlefield. Their culture was pragmatic, sophisticated, and, to their enemies, deeply alien. Their chief gods were Baal Hammon, the stern father figure, and Tanit, the celestial goddess. Roman writers would later accuse them of dark rituals, including child sacrifice, a claim historians still debate but which became a cornerstone of Roman propaganda, painting the Carthaginians as a cruel and godless people. Their military was a direct reflection of their commercial philosophy. The Carthaginian army was a multinational corporation of war, comprised almost entirely of mercenaries. Fierce Celtic warriors from Gaul provided raw courage and brute force in the front lines. Highly specialized slingers from the Balearic Islands could unleash a hail of lead projectiles with terrifying accuracy from a distance. But their greatest asset was the truly exceptional Numidian light cavalry from the deserts of North Africa. Riding small, swift horses without saddles or bridles, these riders were the ultimate skirmishers, masters of the hit-and-run attack, capable of harassing an enemy relentlessly. Carthage paid for the best fighters money could buy. This was both its greatest strength and its most profound weakness. A mercenary army could be assembled quickly, but its loyalty was tied to the purse strings of its employer, a transactional relationship, not one born of love for a homeland. Across the sea, on the Italian peninsula, a completely different power was rising. A power forged not from gold, but from iron. This was Rome. In the 3rd century BC, Rome was not yet the sprawling, marble-clad empire of emperors and Caesars. It was a young, aggressive, and incredibly resilient republic of farmers and soldiers. Its character was shaped by the soil and defined by concepts like gravitas, a deep sense of seriousness and duty, and virtus, manly courage and excellence. The ideal Roman was a man like Cincinnatus, who left his plow to lead an army and, after achieving victory, returned to his farm. Land was the source of wealth, status, and civic duty. Every Roman citizen who owned property was obligated to serve in the military. War was the sacred responsibility of the citizenry. For a Roman, the path to political power, the cursus honorum, ran directly through the military camp. They did not seek to control trade routes for profit. They sought to conquer land, to subjugate peoples, and to incorporate them into their ever-expanding system of alliances. This system was the true source of Rome's strength. It was a tiered structure of control, where conquered peoples became allies, bound by treaties to supply soldiers for the legions. This gave Rome a seemingly inexhaustible pool of manpower that no other Mediterranean power could match. A lost army could and would be replaced. The Roman military was the embodiment of this societal structure. Its heart was the legion, a disciplined force of citizen soldiers. Unlike the diverse mercenaries of Carthage, the Roman army was uniform and standardized. Its genius lay in its flexible organization. The legion was divided into maniples, small, independent units that could maneuver on the battlefield. They typically fought in 3 lines. The first, the hastati, were the youngest men. Behind them were the more experienced principes. And in the final line were the oldest veterans, the triarii, a rock-solid last resort. The legion was a meat grinder, designed to march forward, absorb losses, and methodically destroy whatever stood in its path. Its approach to war was brutal, effective, but often inflexible. So here were the 2 titans. Carthage, the wealthy seafaring empire of merchants, reliant on foreign mercenaries and naval supremacy. And Rome, the agrarian, land-based republic of citizen soldiers, driven by a belief in its divine destiny to rule. They were oil and water. One saw the world as a network of markets to be controlled. The other saw it as a collection of territories to be conquered. A conflict between these 2 opposing philosophies was inevitable. The Mediterranean was simply not big enough for both. Their first clash, a brutal 23-year struggle known as the First Punic War, had already ended. It was a catastrophic defeat for Carthage, stripping it of Sicily and its naval dominance. For Rome, it was a confirmation of their destiny. This outcome did not bring peace. It brought resentment. It left Carthage humiliated and thirsting for vengeance, creating the perfect crucible of hatred from which a new leader, and a new, more terrible war, would soon emerge. The city that tasted this bitter poison of defeat was a world unto itself. Carthage was a metropolis teeming with 500,000 souls, a vibrant, noisy hub of commerce where one could hear dozens of languages spoken in the sprawling markets. Dockworkers from Libya, merchants from Greece, Celtic mercenaries spending their silver, and powerful magistrates in flowing robes all mingled under the African sun. The city was a testament to Carthaginian ingenuity and wealth. Its residential districts rose in multi-story apartment buildings, a level of urban density rivaled only by Rome much later. Life revolved around the 2 magnificent harbors, a rectangular one for commercial shipping, and behind it, the secret circular military port, the Cathan, with its central island housing the Admiralty. This was the nerve center of a global economic network. Power in Carthage was not won on the battlefield, but in the boardroom. The city was governed by a powerful council of wealthy nobles, often referred to as the Senate. But the real authority lay with a smaller, more exclusive body, the Court of 104. These were judges, appointed for life, who held the power to scrutinize the actions of generals and officials. In theory, this was a check against tyranny. In practice, it created a political climate of intense caution and paranoia. A general who failed could face crucifixion. A general who became too successful, too popular with the army, was viewed with suspicion by the oligarchs, who feared he might use his power to seize control of the state. This internal political tension would become a constant shadow over Hannibal's career. The engine of this entire system was money. The empire's wealth was staggering, derived from 2 primary sources. First, their control of maritime trade. Carthaginian ships held a near monopoly on the lucrative trade in metals, particularly silver from the mines of Spain and tin from as far away as Britain, essential for making bronze. They fiercely guarded their trade routes, and their knowledge of the Atlantic currents and coastlines was a state secret. It was said that a Carthaginian captain would rather run his ship aground than allow a rival to follow him to the source of his cargo. The second source of wealth was the vast agricultural estates in North Africa. Unlike the small Roman farmer, Carthaginian agriculture was dominated by massive plantations owned by the aristocracy, worked by slaves and local Libyan subjects. They practiced scientific farming, described in famous treatises like that of Mago, which was so respected that the Romans later translated it into Latin. They produced vast surpluses of grain, wine, and olive oil, not just for the city, but for export. This immense wealth, however, created a deep social divide. The ruling families lived in unimaginable luxury, while the native Libyan population, who worked the land, were treated as second-class subjects, their loyalty maintained by force rather than allegiance. The Carthaginian relationship with religion was complex and, to their enemies, horrifying. While the Roman gods were deeply intertwined with the state and public life, Carthaginian faith seemed more personal and intense. The accusations of child sacrifice at the Tophet, a sacred precinct where urns containing the ashes of infants have been found, remain a subject of fierce debate. Some scholars argue these were beloved children who died of natural causes and were given a special religious burial. Others, citing both Greek and Roman sources, believe that in times of extreme crisis, the elite would sacrifice their own children to appease the gods. Whatever the truth, the perception of this practice allowed Rome to paint its rival not just as a strategic threat, but as a moral abomination that needed to be cleansed from the earth. This was the city that tasted the bitter poison of defeat after the First Punic War. They had lost not just a war, but their identity. Their invincible navy was shattered. Their prized possession, Sicily, was now a Roman province. The massive war indemnity they were forced to pay drained their treasury. This financial crisis led directly to their next catastrophe. They could not pay their mercenaries. The result was the Mercenary War, a brutal 3-year internal conflict where the very soldiers Carthage had hired turned against them, ravaging the African countryside and besieging the city itself. Carthage was brought to its knees, saved only by the military brilliance of one of its few citizen generals, Hamilcar Barca, Hannibal's father. This event left a deep scar. It confirmed to men like Hamilcar that a mercenary army was a double-edged sword, and that the merchant council ruling Carthage was short-sighted and unreliable in a crisis. The seeds of a new military philosophy, one based on personal loyalty to a general rather than transactional employment, were planted in this bloody soil. Across the sea from the merchant princes of Carthage, a starkly different civilization was hardening itself into the dominant force of the Italian peninsula. Rome was not a city of opulent palaces and bustling international markets in the same way as Carthage. It was a city of stone, brick, and iron, whose character had been forged in centuries of relentless warfare against its neighbors. The Roman spirit was grounded in the soil, in the ideal of the citizen farmer who traded his plow for a sword when the Republic called. This connection to the land created a society built on discipline, duty, and an unshakable belief in its own destiny. The core values of the Republic were encapsulated in concepts that every Roman understood. Gravitas demanded a serious, dignified approach to life's responsibilities. Disciplina was the foundation of both military and social order. But most important was virtus, a word that meant more than just virtue. It was a combination of courage, manliness, and excellence, proven above all else on the field of battle. To die for the Republic was the highest honor. This ideology created a population that was willing to endure unimaginable hardships and losses for the sake of the state. It was a psychological resilience that the commercially minded Carthaginians would consistently fail to comprehend. Rome's political structure, the Senate, was a council of elders, composed of the heads of the most powerful aristocratic families. Unlike the Carthaginian council, which was often paralyzed by commercial rivalries, the Roman Senate was a highly effective body for prosecuting war. Its members were men who had served as military commanders themselves. They understood strategy, logistics, and, crucially, the importance of unwavering resolve. In times of crisis, the Senate could appoint a dictator. A single individual granted absolute power for a 6-month term to save the state. This mechanism provided the Republic with the ability to act with swift and unified purpose when its very existence was threatened. The true genius of Rome, however, lay in its system of expansion. When Rome conquered a neighboring city or tribe, it did not simply enslave the population or turn them into tribute-paying subjects. Instead, it bound them into a complex web of alliances. Some conquered peoples were granted full Roman citizenship. Others received partial citizenship, with a promise of full rights in the future. All were required to contribute soldiers to the Roman army. This policy was revolutionary. It meant that with every new conquest, Rome's military power did not just grow, it multiplied. While Carthage had to hire new mercenaries after a defeat, Rome could call upon fresh legions from its vast network of allies. This gave the Republic a nearly bottomless reservoir of manpower, making it almost impossible to defeat through a simple war of attrition. The Roman army was the ultimate expression of the Roman character. The legion was not a collection of individual specialists, but a standardized, interchangeable fighting machine. Its strength was its internal structure. The basic tactical unit was the maniple, a flexible block of 120 men. This allowed a Roman general to maneuver his army with greater precision than the unwieldy phalanxes of other nations. The legion was typically drawn up in 3 lines, the triplex acies. The first line, the hastati, engaged the enemy first. As they tired, they could filter back through the gaps in the second line, the principes, who would then advance to continue the fight with fresh strength. The third line, the triarii, were the elite veterans, held in reserve. They were the Republic's final guarantee of victory, giving rise to the Romans saying, "It has come to the triarii," meaning a situation had become desperate. Each legionary was a masterpiece of military engineering. He wore a bronze helmet, a chest plate, and carried a large, curved shield, the scutum, which provided excellent protection. His primary weapons were the pilum, a heavy throwing spear designed to bend on impact so it couldn't be thrown back, and the gladius, a short, brutally effective stabbing sword. Roman tactics were simple and savage. The legion would advance, unleash a volley of pila to disrupt the enemy formation, and then close in for close-quarters combat with the gladius. It was a system built for relentless, methodical slaughter. This army was not designed for elegant maneuvers. It was designed to grind its enemies into dust through sheer discipline and organized violence. This was the force that awaited Hannibal. It was predictable, dogmatic, and supremely confident in its own superiority. And it had never before faced a mind that could turn its greatest strengths into its most fatal weaknesses. The first great clash between these two titans was a war that neither side truly understood at the outset. It began over a trivial dispute in Sicily, but it quickly spiraled into a colossal 23-year struggle for control of the western Mediterranean. The war was fought primarily at sea, which should have been a decisive advantage for Carthage. The Punic fleet was the envy of the ancient world, its sailors possessing generations of maritime knowledge. The Romans, by contrast, were a land power. Their experience with naval warfare was minimal. They were farmers and legionaries, not sailors. By all logic, Rome should have been swept from the seas. But the Romans possessed a quality that would define their history: a stubborn, almost fanatical refusal to accept defeat, combined with a genius for practical innovation. After losing their initial fleets to storms and Carthaginian skill, they captured a wrecked Punic warship, a quinquereme, and reverse-engineered it. In an astonishing feat of mass production, they constructed over 100 copies in just 2 months. But they knew they could not outsail the Carthaginians. So they changed the rules of the game. They invented a device that would nullify the enemy's advantage: the corvus, or the crow. It was a long, heavy boarding bridge with a massive, sharp spike on its underside. When a Roman ship rammed an enemy vessel, the corvus would be dropped. The spike would embed itself in the enemy's deck, locking the two ships together. Suddenly, a naval battle was transformed into a land battle at sea. The superior Carthaginian seamanship meant nothing when disciplined Roman legionaries were storming across the bridge, gladius in hand. It was a brutal, brilliant solution, and it cost Carthage its naval supremacy. While the politicians in Carthage wavered, one general fought with ferocious tenacity in Sicily. Hamilcar Barca, the father of Hannibal. For years, he waged a brilliant guerrilla campaign from his mountain strongholds, tying down Roman legions with a fraction of their numbers. He was a master of the hit-and-run raid, a constant thorn in the side of the Roman war effort. But he was a lone genius, fighting a war his own government seemed unwilling to fully support. He pleaded for more men and more money, but the merchant council, ever wary of a general gaining too much power, offered only meager aid. This was a bitter lesson that Hamilcar would never forget, and a lesson he would undoubtedly pass on to his young son, Hannibal, that the most dangerous enemies could sometimes be found not on the battlefield, but in the senate of your own city. Ultimately, the war was decided not by a single heroic general, but by Roman perseverance. After more than 2 decades of grueling warfare, Rome, using its vast resources, built one final fleet and crushed the last Carthaginian navy at the Aegates Islands in 241 BC. The defeat was absolute. Carthage, exhausted and bankrupt, sued for peace. The terms were humiliating. They were forced to abandon Sicily completely, which became Rome's first overseas province. They had to return all Roman prisoners without ransom, and they were ordered to pay a staggering war indemnity in silver, a sum so large it would cripple their economy for years to come. For the proud city, it was a wound that cut to the very soul. The sea, their birthright, now belonged to Rome. This crushing defeat was the world into which Hannibal was born. He grew up in a city shrouded in the shadow of humiliation. But the worst was yet to come. With Carthage's treasury empty, the state could not pay the tens of thousands of mercenaries who had fought its wars. Those mercenaries revolted in what became known as the Truceless War, a conflict of such savagery that it nearly destroyed the city. As Carthage fought for its very survival against its former employees, Rome saw an opportunity. In an act of breathtaking cynicism and treachery, the Roman Senate declared that Carthage's preparations to defend itself were a violation of the peace treaty. Using this as a pretext, Rome seized the islands of Sardinia and Corsica and demanded an even larger payment of silver. This was the moment that transformed a political rivalry into a blood feud. To the Carthaginians, and especially to a man like Hamilcar Barca, this was an unforgivable injustice. It was one thing to be defeated in a fair fight. It was another to be kicked while you were down, to be robbed by the victor under the guise of law. This act of Roman opportunism did more to ensure a second war than any treaty could do to prevent one. It planted a seed of pure, unadulterated hatred in the heart of the Barca family. It was this legacy of defeat, this memory of betrayal, and this burning sense of injustice that Hamilcar would carry with him to Spain. And it was this same fire that he would use to forge his 9-year-old son, Hannibal, into the weapon that would one day make Rome tremble. In the smoking ruins of the mercenary war, one man stood above all others as the savior of Carthage: Hamilcar Barca. He was not a member of the city's oldest, wealthiest families. He was a soldier's soldier, a man whose reputation was forged in the fires of Sicily and solidified in the brutal campaign to put down the mercenary revolt. His very name, Barca, meant Thunderbolt in the Punic language, and it was a fitting description. On the battlefield, he was known for the shocking speed and decisiveness of his attacks, a stark contrast to the cautious, profit-driven calculations of the politicians he served. He had saved the Republic, but the experience had filled him with a cold contempt for its rulers. He saw them as weak, short-sighted men who had nearly allowed his city to perish through their greed and incompetence. Hamilcar understood a truth that the Carthaginian Senate refused to see. The peace with Rome was a sham. The cynical seizure of Sardinia was proof that Rome was not a rival to be managed, but a predator that would not rest until Carthage was completely destroyed. While the Senate debated trade routes, Hamilcar saw an existential threat. He knew that to fight Rome on its own terms, Carthage needed something it had never possessed: a professional, loyal, and battle-hardened army, independent of the whims of politicians and the transactional loyalty of mercenaries. And he knew just where to build it. His gaze turned to Spain, the Iberian Peninsula. To most Carthaginians, Spain was a distant land, a source of silver and recruits. To Hamilcar, it was the key to the future. It was a land of rugged mountains and fierce Celtic and Iberian tribes, the perfect crucible in which to forge a new army. It was rich in natural resources, especially the silver mines that could fund a war without having to beg for money from the Senate in Carthage. Hamilcar presented a brilliant political argument to the council. Allow him to go to Spain to restore Carthaginian interests and gather the funds to pay the new indemnity Rome had imposed. The Senate, eager to be rid of this popular and intimidating general, readily agreed. They had no idea that Hamilcar was not planning to serve their interests. He was planning to build an empire for his family, the Barcids. This was a revolutionary act. Hamilcar was essentially creating a private kingdom, a personal power base loyal only to him. Upon arriving in Spain, he began a 9-year campaign of conquest, diplomacy, and nation-building. He fought when he had to, crushing rebellious tribes with the ruthless efficiency that defined him. But he also governed. He founded a new capital, Acre, and skillfully managed the complex web of tribal alliances, often marrying his daughters to local chieftains to secure their loyalty. The silver from the mines flowed directly to him, allowing him to pay his soldiers generously and consistently, ensuring their devotion. The army he built was a new hybrid force. It combined the best of the old mercenary system: Numidian cavalry, Balearic slingers, with a core of Libyan infantry and, increasingly, fierce Spanish warriors. But this was no longer a collection of contractors. It was Hamilcar's army. Their loyalty was to him, the general who led them from the front, shared their hardships, and rewarded their victories. Throughout these years of conquest and consolidation, his sons were by his side. They did not grow up in palaces in Carthage, learning the arts of debate and commerce. They grew up in the harsh, unforgiving environment of a permanent military campaign. His eldest son, Hannibal, breathed the air of the army camp. His lullabies were the sounds of swords being sharpened and marching orders being called. He learned geography not from maps, but by riding across the dusty plains of Iberia. He learned politics not from books, but by watching his father negotiate with bearded tribal kings. And he learned the art of war not in a classroom, but by observing the master, Hamilcar, on the battlefield. This was Hamilcar's true, secret project. He was not just building an army to fight Rome. He was raising the general who would lead it. Every strategic decision, every diplomatic maneuver, every lesson in leadership was an education for the young Hannibal. Hamilcar was instilling in his son his own military genius, his own understanding of logistics and psychology, and above all, his own profound, all-consuming hatred for Rome. He was convinced that the final showdown was inevitable, and he was determined that his family, the Barcids, the sons of the Thunderbolt, would be the ones to lead Carthage into that apocalyptic struggle. He was forging more than a power base in Spain. He was forging a dynasty of vengeance. And the centerpiece of that dynasty, the living weapon he was crafting with meticulous care, was his son, Hannibal. The weapon Hamilcar Barca was forging in Spain was not shaped by books or tutors, but by the harsh realities of a soldier's life. While the sons of Roman senators were studying rhetoric and the law, and the sons of Carthaginian merchants were learning accounting and trade routes, Hannibal was receiving an education of an entirely different kind. His school was the military camp. His teachers were veteran mercenaries. His curriculum was survival and conquest. This upbringing would create a commander unlike any Rome had ever faced. From the age of 9, Hannibal's life was a continuous military campaign. He learned to ride a horse before he mastered complex philosophy. He learned how to read the contours of the land for an ambush, how to select a defensible position for a camp, and how to track an enemy's movements. These were not theoretical lessons. He rode with the reconnaissance patrols, listening as Iberian scouts deciphered broken twigs and faint tracks in the dust. He watched engineers construct siege engines and fortifications, understanding the practical application of geometry and physics under pressure. He learned the grim arithmetic of logistics. How many pounds of grain an army needed per day, how far a mule train could travel, and the critical importance of securing supply lines. This education was profoundly physical. The Roman historian Livy, a man who despised Hannibal, was later forced to admit his enemy's incredible stamina. This endurance was cultivated in his youth. Hannibal slept on the ground, wrapped in a simple military cloak, often among the common soldiers and sentries on watch. He learned to endure the searing heat of the Spanish summer and the biting cold of its winters with equal indifference. He ate the same coarse rations as his father's men: hard bread, salted meat, and cheap wine. This was not merely for show. It was a fundamental part of his training. It forged a body that was seemingly immune to fatigue and a mind that remained sharp and clear in the face of extreme hardship. It also fostered a deep, unspoken bond with the common soldier. They saw in him not a distant aristocrat, but one of their own, a leader who understood their suffering because he had shared it. Crucially, his upbringing gave him an unparalleled understanding of human psychology. His father's army was a melting pot of cultures. Hannibal grew up hearing the guttural sounds of Celtic languages, the quick speech of the Iberians, and the various dialects of North Africa. He learned to communicate with these men not just with words, but by understanding their unique cultural codes. He knew what motivated a Gallic warrior: a love of personal glory and plunder. He understood the fierce loyalty of the Iberian tribes once their trust was earned. He recognized the pride and skill of the Numidian horsemen. This ethnographic education was priceless. It allowed him to inspire loyalty in a diverse, potentially volatile army of mercenaries in a way no other Carthaginian general ever could. He knew which men to praise, which to challenge, and which to reward to get the absolute best out of them. He also learned the darker arts of leadership from his father. He witnessed firsthand how Hamilcar could use a combination of charm, intimidation, and calculated generosity to bend proud chieftains to his will. He saw that loyalty could be bought with silver, but true devotion was earned through shared danger and mutual respect. He learned that a commander's presence on the battlefield, his willingness to lead from the front and risk his own life, was the most powerful motivator of all. Hamilcar was not just his father. He was his mentor, his commanding officer, and the living example of the kind of leader he was expected to become. By the time Hamilcar was killed in battle in 229 BC, the 18-year-old Hannibal was no longer a boy. He was a seasoned military officer. The years that followed, serving under his brother-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair, would see him rise to command the cavalry, the most prestigious and critical arm of the Carthaginian forces. He honed his skills in countless skirmishes and battles, earning a reputation for audacious courage and brilliant tactical thinking. The soldiers adored him. They saw in him the reincarnation of his father, the same fire in his eyes, the same lightning-fast mind, the same quiet confidence. He was more comfortable in a leather cuirass than a senator's toga, more at home in a military tent than a palace. His entire existence had been a preparation for a single overarching purpose. The tool had been sharpened. All it needed was a hand to wield it and a cause to be unleashed upon. The image of Hannibal forged in the war camp, tough, enduring, a master of practical warfare, is accurate, but it is incomplete. Roman propaganda would later paint him as a savage barbarian, driven by a crude, almost animalistic hatred. This was a comforting lie, a way for Rome to explain its devastating defeats at the hands of a single man. The truth was far more terrifying. The mind inside the battle-scarred warrior was not that of a barbarian. It was as sharp, sophisticated, and well-educated as any in the Mediterranean world. Hamilcar Barca was determined to create not just a soldier, but a strategic genius, and for that, military training alone was not enough. Alongside the education in mud and blood, Hamilcar provided his sons with the finest classical education that money could buy. He hired Greek tutors, men like Sosilas of Sparta, to instruct the young Hannibal. In the 3rd century BC, Greek or Hellenistic culture was the dominant intellectual force of the age. To be educated meant to be educated in the Greek tradition. This meant Hannibal was not just a Punic commander. He was a product of the same intellectual world that produced the great philosophers, playwrights, and historians of Athens and Alexandria. His curriculum would have been rigorous. He would have studied rhetoric, the art of public speaking, and persuasive argument. This was not merely an academic exercise. For a future commander of a multilingual mercenary army, the ability to inspire, to command, and to convince through the power of speech was a critical tool. His later ability to hold together a fractious army of Gauls, Spaniards, and Africans for 15 years in a foreign land owed as much to his rhetorical skill as to his military victories. He learned to speak and write in Greek fluently, the international language of diplomacy and high command at the time. Most importantly, he studied history. He would have read the works of Herodotus and Thucydides, analyzing the great conflicts of the past. But one figure would have dominated his studies: Alexander the Great. The story of the Macedonian king who, with a relatively small but professional army, shattered the mighty Persian Empire and marched to the ends of the known world, was the ultimate case study in military genius. From Alexander, Hannibal learned the principles of audacious strategy, the importance of striking deep into enemy territory to force a decisive outcome. He studied Alexander's revolutionary use of combined arms tactics, coordinating infantry, cavalry, and skirmishers into a seamless symphony of destruction. The famous hammer-and-anvil tactic, where the infantry, the anvil, holds the enemy in place while the cavalry, the hammer, smashes into their rear, was a lesson Hannibal absorbed and would later perfect with devastating effect. This intellectual training gave Hannibal a perspective that his Roman opponents lacked. Roman generals were practical men, products of a rigid system. They learned a specific, effective way of war, and they rarely deviated from it. Hannibal, having studied the entire history of warfare, had a library of strategies in his mind. He could think outside the Roman playbook. He understood the value of deception, of psychological warfare, and of tailoring his tactics to the specific terrain and the specific weaknesses of the opposing commander. His mind was a flexible, adaptive weapon, not a blunt instrument. Imagine the young man this dual education created. One day, he is on a forced march, eating hardtack and sleeping on the cold ground, learning the limits of human endurance. The next day, he is in a tent with his tutor, analyzing the Battle of Gaugamela, debating the philosophical points of a Socratic dialogue, or practicing a speech in flawless Greek. This was the source of his unique genius: the fusion of two worlds. He had the physical toughness of a mercenary and the intellectual sophistication of a Greek philosopher king. He had the unbreakable will of a Punic avenger, forged in the fires of his family's humiliation, combined with the analytical mind of a master strategist. This combination made him utterly incomprehensible to his Roman adversaries. They expected to fight a barbarian general, and instead they found a man who could outthink them at every turn. He was a polymath of war, as comfortable discussing Greek literature as he was at orchestrating a complex cavalry maneuver. He was not just the product of a war camp. He was the product of a deliberate, meticulous, and brilliant education designed for a single purpose: the intellectual, psychological, and military destruction of the Roman Republic. The year was 237 BC. Hamilcar Barca, having secured his command, was preparing to depart for Spain. This was the beginning of his great project, the first step on a long road he hoped would lead to the gates of Rome itself. Before embarking, he did as all ancient commanders did. He sought the favor of the gods. In one of Carthage's great temples, likely dedicated to Baal Hammon, Hamilcar was performing a solemn sacrifice, praying for success in his ambitious venture. The air would have been thick with the smoke of incense and the scent of roasting meat from the offering. Observing the ceremony was his 9-year-old son, Hannibal. Filled with the natural curiosity and excitement of a boy, he approached his father and, as children do, began asking to be taken along on the great adventure. Most fathers might have dismissed the request, promising to return with gifts. But Hamilcar saw something else in his son's eyes. The same fire, the same intensity that burned within himself. He saw the culmination of his hopes, the vessel for his vengeance. He agreed to take Hannibal, but on one profound condition. What happened next would become the defining legend of Hannibal's life, a story repeated with a mixture of awe and horror by the Roman historians who recorded it. Hamilcar led his small son to the foot of the altar, where the remains of the sacrificed animal still lay. He instructed the boy to place his hand directly upon the offering. Then, in the solemn presence of the gods, he made him swear an oath. The words, echoing in that sacred space, would seal the boy's fate forever. He swore that as soon as he was old enough, he would prove himself an enemy of the Roman people. He swore that he would hold this enmity for the rest of his days. He swore eternal hatred toward Rome. This was not a political promise. It was a sacred vow, a religious sacrament that bound the boy's soul to a single terrible purpose. In that moment, the war with Rome ceased to be a mere strategic conflict for Hannibal. It became a personal, holy crusade. It was the entire reason for his existence, the central organizing principle of his life. Every lesson from his Greek tutors, every hard day spent in the military camp, every piece of wisdom passed down from his father was now channeled toward the fulfillment of this vow. It gave his life a terrifying clarity and a relentless focus that other men, driven by ambition for wealth or power, could never match. Hannibal was not fighting for a salary, or for glory, or even for the abstract concept of Carthage. He was fighting to fulfill a sacred duty sworn to his father and his gods. This oath explains the man he would become. It explains his unshakable resolve in the face of impossible odds. It explains his willingness to endure 15 years of brutal warfare on enemy soil, cut off from home, often without support. While other commanders might have wavered or sought a negotiated peace, for Hannibal, there was no alternative. Compromise was a betrayal of his vow. Defeat was a failure of his sacred mission. His goal was not merely to win battles. It was to humble Rome, to break its power, to avenge the humiliation of his father and his people. The psychological weight of such a vow, sworn at such a tender age, is immense. It shaped him into a man who was utterly dedicated, but perhaps also incapable of seeing a world beyond the shadow of his hatred. He was a prisoner of his own promise. While his nemesis-to-be, Scipio Africanus, would later be able to separate the war from the peace, to defeat his enemy and then offer reasonable terms, Hannibal's worldview was absolute. Rome was the enemy, and the enemy had to be destroyed. There was no room for nuance. As the 9-year-old boy removed his hand from the altar, his childhood was officially over. He was no longer just the son of a general. He was a consecrated instrument of vengeance. He would now sail to Spain with his father, not as a passenger, but as an acolyte beginning his long and brutal apprenticeship. The fire that Hamilcar had kindled with the stories of defeat and betrayal was now contained, focused, and given a divine sanction. The story of Hannibal Barca, the commander, the genius, the terror of Rome, truly begins here, in the smoke and shadows of a Carthaginian temple, with the solemn promise of a child to live and die as the eternal enemy of Rome. The Spain that Hamilcar Barca and his young son Hannibal arrived in was not a unified country, but a fierce mosaic of Celtic and Iberian tribes. It was a land of opportunity and immense danger. For the next 9 years, Hamilcar waged a relentless campaign that was part conquest, part nation-building. He was creating something new on the European continent, a personal military state, funded by local resources and loyal only to his family. This was the true foundation of Hannibal's future war. Hamilcar's strategy was a masterclass in colonial expansion. He subdued hostile tribes with a brutal efficiency that solidified his reputation as the Thunderbolt. Yet, he was more than a mere conqueror. He understood that long-term control could not be maintained by force alone. He engaged in shrewd diplomacy, forging alliances with powerful chieftains, securing their loyalty through treaties, gifts, and strategic marriages. The vast silver mines of the region, particularly those around the Sierra Morena, were swiftly brought under his control. For the first time, a Carthaginian general had a private treasury. He could pay his troops well, equip them with the finest weapons, and fund his operations without sending a single request back to the suspicious Senate in Carthage. He was building an engine of war, accountable to no one but himself. Hannibal grew from a boy into a young man in this environment. He fought in his father's campaigns, learning the harsh lessons of warfare against the fierce Spanish tribesmen. He saw how his father adapted his tactics to the rugged terrain, abandoning the set-piece battles of the past for ambushes, rapid marches, and guerrilla warfare. He learned how to lead a diverse army, earning the respect of men from a dozen different cultures not through birthright, but through courage and competence. This was the crucible that forged his military mind. In 229 BC, disaster struck. Hamilcar, leading his troops in a battle or a tactical withdrawal, drowned while crossing a river. The grand project of the Barcids could have died with him. But the army's loyalty was not just to Hamilcar. It was to his family and his vision. Command passed seamlessly to his son-in-law, Hasdrubal, a man known as the Fair for his handsome appearance and diplomatic skill. Where Hamilcar had been the conqueror, Hasdrubal was the consolidator. He understood that the new province needed stability to truly flourish. Hasdrubal's reign was marked by a shift from military conquest to diplomacy and infrastructure. His greatest achievement was the founding of a magnificent new capital on the Spanish coast, a city he named Carthage, the New City, which the Romans would later call Carthago Nova, or New Carthage, modern-day Cartagena. This city became the administrative, military, and financial heart of the Barcid Empire. It had a superb natural harbor and was located near the richest silver mines, making it a perfect base of operations. Hasdrubal extended Carthaginian influence through peaceful means, persuading many local tribes to accept his authority without a fight. This growing power in Spain did not go unnoticed by Rome. Worried about the rise of this new Barcid state, the Romans sent an embassy to Hasdrubal. The result, in 226 BC, was the Ebro Treaty. It was a simple agreement designed to prevent conflict by drawing a line in the sand. Hasdrubal agreed that Carthaginian armies would not cross the Ebro River in arms. The Romans, in turn, implicitly recognized Carthaginian control over everything south of that river. For the moment, an uneasy peace was established. During Hasdrubal's 8-year rule, Hannibal continued his apprenticeship. As commander of the cavalry, he was his brother-in-law's chief military officer. He led countless expeditions to pacify remote tribes and secure the borders of their growing territory. In these campaigns, He perfected his handling of the army's most potent weapon, the combination of heavy Spanish cavalry and the swift, unpredictable Numidians. He became a charismatic and beloved leader, known for being the first into battle and the last to retreat. The veterans who had served his father now looked upon him with a mixture of pride and awe, seeing the Thunderbolt reborn in the sun. By 221 BC, the Barcid province was a formidable power. It had a full treasury, a large and veteran army fanatically loyal to its commanders, and a secure strategic base. The weapon was fully forged, tempered, and sharpened. It only needed a hand to guide it. And that year, an assassin's blade would ensure it found its master. In 221 BC, the assassin's blade found its mark. Hasdrubal the Fair, the diplomat and city builder, was struck down by a Celtic slave avenging the death of his former master. In an instant, the 8 years of calm consolidation were over. A dangerous power vacuum was created, and the future of the Barcid enterprise hung in the balance. The steady hand of the diplomat was gone, and the formidable army in Spain was left without a leader. For a brief moment, the enemies of the Barcids both in Spain and in Carthage may have believed the project would now collapse. They were wrong. The decision of who would succeed Hasdrubal was not made in the council chambers of Carthage, hundreds of miles away. It was made in the dust and heat of the army camp in New Carthage, by the men who had bled for the Barcid cause. There was only one candidate they would accept. The moment the news of Hasdrubal's death spread, the soldiers swarmed to the commander's headquarters. With one voice, a wave of acclamation rose from thousands of throats. They called for Hannibal. He was 26 years old, but he was already a legend among them. They were not choosing him simply because he was Hamilcar's son. They were choosing the young officer who had grown up among them, the commander who had shared their rations and slept on the same hard ground. They were choosing the brilliant cavalry leader whose tactical genius they had witnessed firsthand in 100 skirmishes, the man who was always the first to charge into danger and the last to leave the field. In his eyes, they saw the same burning intensity as his father. In his voice, they heard the same quiet authority. To the veterans, he was Hamilcar reborn. To the younger soldiers, he was the embodiment of the martial spirit that defined their army. He was their leader, and they would accept no other. This acclamation by the army was a revolutionary act. It was a military election, a declaration that their loyalty was to the Barcid family, not to the distant government of Carthage. The choice of the soldiers was sent back to the capital for formal ratification, but it was a foregone conclusion. The Carthaginian Senate was presented with a choice. Either endorse the charismatic young general who had the fanatical loyalty of their best army, or risk a full-blown mutiny. The peace faction, which feared the aggressive ambition of the Barcids, argued against the appointment, but their voices were drowned out. To oppose Hannibal now would be to lose Spain and the vast wealth it generated. Reluctantly, the Senate confirmed his command. Hannibal was now the absolute master of the Barcid dominion in Spain. The change in leadership was immediate and profound. The era of diplomacy was over. The era of the sword had begun. Hannibal was not a builder of cities. He was a conqueror of them. His first objective was to finish what his father had started: the complete subjugation of all tribes south of the Ebro River. For the next 2 years, he waged a series of brilliant and brutal campaigns. He marched his army into the heart of central Spain, a region no Carthaginian force had ever reached. He stormed the heavily fortified city of the Alcaides and then turned on the powerful Vacii tribe, capturing their capital, Salamantica. These campaigns were not just about conquest. They were a calculated demonstration of his leadership and a brutal training exercise for his army. He was testing their limits, honing their discipline, and perfecting the complex coordination of his diverse military machine. He led a daring assault across the Tagus River, crushing a massive tribal coalition in a battle that showcased his tactical genius. He used his cavalry to feign a retreat, luring the enemy into a disordered chase across the river, only to turn and annihilate them when they were most vulnerable. By the end of 220 BC, his work was done. All of Spain south of the Ebro was firmly under his control. His treasury was full of plunder. His army was a veteran force at the peak of its power, utterly devoted to him and eager for a greater challenge. The weapon his father had envisioned was now his to command. It was sharp, it was ready, and it was aimed directly at the heart of the Roman Republic. All he needed now was a reason to strike, a pretext to unleash the storm and fulfill the oath he had sworn at the altar so many years before. With all of southern Spain subjugated, Hannibal's war machine was poised and ready. The army was a veteran force, the treasury was full, and the commander's will was absolute. But a direct, unprovoked attack on Roman territory was not his style. Hamilcar had taught him not only how to fight, but how to think. A war needed a cause, a casus belli, not for moral reasons, but for strategic ones. A legitimate pretext would unify his supporters, divide his enemies, and allow him to seize the initiative. He found his perfect tool in the city of Saguntum. Saguntum was a prosperous Iberian port city located on the Spanish coast, about 100 miles south of the Ebro River. Its position was a deliberate diplomatic powder keg. Geographically, it was well within the Barcid sphere of influence as defined by the Ebro Treaty. Politically, however, Saguntum had formed an alliance with Rome years earlier. It was a legal tripwire, a gray area that both powers had allowed to exist, each interpreting it to their own advantage. For Rome, Saguntum was a useful listening post and a check on Carthaginian expansion. For Hannibal, it was the perfect lever to start a war. He did not simply march up and attack the city. His approach was far more cunning. He manufactured a local crisis. He encouraged a neighboring tribe, the Turbolidi, who were allies of Carthage, to pick a border dispute with Saguntum. When the Saguntines inevitably retaliated, Hannibal had his excuse. He could now claim he was acting not as an aggressor, but as a defender of his allies, bringing a troublesome neighbor to heel. It was a masterful piece of political theater, designed to give him the moral high ground and paint the Saguntines as the aggressors. Saguntum, trusting in its powerful Roman ally, resisted. They sent urgent appeals to Rome, detailing the Carthaginian provocations. Rome's response was slow and complacent. They were distracted by wars in Illyria and failed to grasp the scale of the threat. They saw Hannibal as an impetuous young general, not as the avatar of a new total war. They sent a series of embassies, first to Hannibal in Spain, and then to the Senate in Carthage. Hannibal treated the Roman envoys with cold disdain, accusing Rome of interfering in his sphere of influence. He was playing for time, drawing out the diplomatic process while moving his army into position. In 219 BC, with the diplomatic charade exhausted, Hannibal laid siege to Saguntum. He expected a quick victory, but he had underestimated the city's resolve. The siege of Saguntum turned into a brutal 8-month struggle. The citizens fought with desperate courage, believing until the very end that Roman legions would appear over the horizon to save them. They never did. Hannibal prosecuted the siege with relentless energy. He was a constant presence among his troops, planning the assaults, inspecting the siege engines, and sharing the dangers. During one attack, he ventured too close to the walls and was seriously wounded in the thigh by a javelin. His injury only hardened his resolve and fueled the fury of his men. The fall of the city was a horrific spectacle. After 8 months of starvation and combat, the last defenders were overwhelmed. Many of the leading citizens, seeing that all was lost, built a great fire in the city square, threw their treasures into it, and then walked into the flames themselves, choosing suicide over surrender. Hannibal showed no mercy to the rest. The adult male population was executed, and the women and children were sold into slavery. But the true prize was the city's immense wealth. The plunder was so vast that it was enough to pay his soldiers, send a rich portion back to Carthage to win over political support, and, most importantly, finance the opening stages of the titanic campaign he was planning. The news of Saguntum's fall finally shook Rome from its complacency. An embassy, led by the elder statesman Quintus Fabius Maximus, was dispatched to Carthage with an ultimatum. They were not there to negotiate. They were there to demand that Carthage hand over Hannibal and his senior officers for punishment as war criminals. The Roman delegation was brought before the Carthaginian Senate. The mood was tense. The moment of truth had arrived. After the Carthaginian senators refused to accept sole responsibility, Fabius stood before them. In a gesture of supreme theatricality, he clutched the folds of his toga. "In these folds," he declared, "I bring you war and peace. Choose which you will have." The presiding Carthaginian magistrate defiantly replied, "You choose." Fabius shook out the folds of his toga. "Then I give you war," he said. A roar of approval came back from the Carthaginian senators. "We accept it." The Second Punic War had officially begun. But the two sides were preparing for two completely different conflicts. The Romans, following their logical conventional playbook, planned to fight a war of expedition. One consul would prepare an army to invade Spain and deal with Hannibal there. Another would prepare an even larger force to invade Africa and threaten Carthage directly. They assumed they would be fighting the war on their terms, on enemy territory. They had no inkling of the truly insane, audacious plan forming in the mind of their new enemy. Hannibal had no intention of waiting for the Romans to come to him. He was going to take the war to them, striking them in a place they thought was invulnerable: their own home. The declarations of war echoed across the Mediterranean. In Rome, the machinery of the Republic began to turn with ponderous and predictable certainty. The two newly elected consuls for the year, Publius Cornelius Scipio and Tiberius Sempronius Longus, drew lots for their assignments. Scipio was given the task of confronting Hannibal in Spain. Longus was given the greater prize: a massive army and a fleet of 160 warships to invade Africa and lay siege to Carthage itself. The Roman plan was a classic expression of their strategic thinking: direct, overwhelming, and aimed at the enemy's homelands. They would fight the war far from Italy, on their own terms. But in his winter camp at New Carthage, Hannibal was not preparing for a defensive war. He knew that waiting for the Romans to attack would be a slow death. A passive defense of Spain or Africa would allow Rome to leverage its greatest advantage: its inexhaustible manpower. He could win battle after battle, but Rome would simply raise new legions from its allies, slowly grinding his veteran army down in a war of attrition. More importantly, a defensive war would concede the initiative to Rome. Hannibal's entire military philosophy was built on the opposite principle: attack, on surprise, on dictating the time and place of every engagement. His strategic assessment was as cold as it was brilliant. The Roman navy, rebuilt and dominant after the First War, controlled the sea. A direct seaborne invasion of Italy was impossible. Therefore, the only path was the land. But his target was not what the Romans imagined. He was not aiming to capture the city of Rome, at least not initially. He knew he lacked the numbers and the siege equipment for such a task. His true target was far more strategic: the very foundation of Roman power, its confederation of allies. Hannibal understood something about Rome that the Romans themselves took for granted. Rome's strength was not in the city itself, but in the vast network of Italian peoples, the Samnites, Etruscans, Campanians, and others, that it had conquered and bound to its will. These allies provided the endless river of soldiers that filled the ranks of the legions. Hannibal believed this alliance was not built on loyalty, but on fear. He reasoned that if he could march an army into Italy and prove that Rome was not invincible, that it could be beaten repeatedly and humiliatingly on its own soil, then that fear would crumble. He would present himself not as a foreign invader come to plunder, but as a liberator. His message to the Italian peoples would be simple: "I have come to free you from your Roman masters. Join me, and we will break the chains of the Republic together." This was the core of his grand strategy. He would turn Rome's greatest strength into its greatest weakness, using its own allies to destroy it from within. His first and most important potential allies were the Celtic tribes of the Pei Valley in northern Italy. They were recent and unwilling subjects of Rome, and Hannibal knew they would flock to his banner if he could reach them with a credible army. They would provide him with fresh troops and a secure base of operations to begin his campaign. But to get there, he would have to achieve the impossible. The journey he envisioned was one of the most audacious military undertakings in human history. From New Carthage, he would have to march his army of some 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and most famously, 37 war elephants, on an epic trek of nearly 1,000 miles. He would first have to cross the Pyrenees Mountains. Then he would have to fight his way across the hostile territory of southern Gaul, modern-day France. He would have to cross the Rhone, one of Europe's widest and fastest-flowing rivers. And finally, he would face the most formidable barrier of all, the Alps. In the ancient world, the Alps were more than a mountain range. They were a mythical boundary. They were considered the impassable wall that the gods had placed to protect Italy from the barbarian north. No army of any significant size had ever successfully crossed them. To attempt it in late autumn, with winter snows already beginning to fall, was considered not just risky, but suicidal. But for Hannibal, the sheer impossibility of the feat was its greatest strategic advantage. Because the Romans considered it impossible, they would not be looking for him there. The psychological shock of his army appearing from the one direction no one was guarding would be immense. It would be as if an army had descended from the heavens. It was a gamble of breathtaking proportions. He was effectively abandoning his secure base in Spain, marching his army into the heart of the enemy, and cutting himself off from all hope of retreat or regular reinforcement. His survival and the success of the entire war would depend entirely on his ability to win decisive victories and to live off the land in a hostile country. He was staking the fate of Carthage on his own genius, the endurance of his men, and the hope that he could ignite a general rebellion against Roman rule. This was Hannibal's plan: audacious, borderline insane, and utterly brilliant. It was a strategy born from a mind that saw not just the battlefield, but the entire political and psychological landscape of the war. In the spring of 218 BC, the Great March began. Leaving his younger brother, another Hasdrubal, in command of Spain, Hannibal led his army out of New Carthage and turned north. The force that set out on this epic journey was one of the finest fighting forces in the world. Roughly 40,000 veteran infantry from Africa and Spain, 8,000 elite cavalry, and the famous contingent of 37 war elephants. This was not just an army. It was a mobile nation, a testament to the Barcid Empire in Spain. The first obstacle was the Pyrenees. The crossing itself was difficult, but the real challenge came from the fierce tribes that controlled the passes. Hannibal had to fight his way through northern Spain, subduing the local peoples in a swift and brutal campaign. The cost was high. He lost several thousand men in combat, and he was forced to leave a significant detachment of over 10,000 troops under his general Hanno to secure the newly conquered territory and keep the supply lines open. By the time he reached the Rhone River in southern Gaul, his army had already shrunk considerably. At the Rhone, he faced a double threat. On the far bank, a large army from the Gallic Volsi tribe had gathered to dispute his passage. Meanwhile, news arrived that the Roman consul Publius Scipio had landed with his army at Massilia, modern-day Marseille, and was marching north to intercept him. Time was running out. Here, Hannibal displayed the tactical flexibility that would become his hallmark. He sent a small detachment under his subordinate Hanno on a forced march upriver. Under the cover of darkness, Hanno's men crossed the river on hastily constructed rafts and took up a position on the hills behind the Gallic camp. The next day, as Hannibal began ostentatiously preparing his main force to cross, Hanno's men lit a signal fire and charged down upon the rear of the Gallic army. Caught between two forces, the Gauls panicked and scattered. Hannibal's main army crossed the river with little opposition. The elephants, however, presented a unique challenge. Terrified of the wide, fast-flowing water, they refused to board the rafts. Hannibal's engineers solved the problem with ingenuity. They built enormous earthen piers out into the river, then attached massive rafts to the end, covering them with soil to create the illusion of solid ground. The elephants were lured onto the rafts, which were then cut loose and ferried across. By the time Scipio's Roman cavalry patrol arrived, all they found were the dying embers of Hannibal's campfires. The Carthaginian army was gone, having vanished north towards the Alps. Scipio was dumbfounded. He could not believe that Hannibal would actually attempt the suicidal Alpine crossing so late in the year. Assuming it was a feint, he made a fateful decision. He sent the bulk of his army on to Spain to cut Hannibal's supposed supply lines, while he himself sailed back to northern Italy to raise a new army, expecting to face a shattered remnant of the enemy force if they ever emerged from the mountains. In late October, Hannibal's army reached the foothills of the Alps. The soldiers, men accustomed to the warm climates of Africa and Spain, stared up in horror at the towering snow-covered peaks that seemed to pierce the sky. What followed was 15 days of hell. This was not a war against men, but against nature itself. The paths were narrow, treacherous, and covered in ice and snow. Men and heavily laden pack animals constantly slipped and tumbled thousands of feet into the chasms below. The cold was a relentless enemy, freezing the soldiers in their sleep and causing frostbite that blackened their limbs. To make matters worse, the local mountain tribes, seeing the long, vulnerable column of soldiers, launched constant attacks. They would hide in the high passes, rolling massive boulders down onto the path, crushing men and animals and creating chaos. Hannibal was forced to fight his way through a series of brutal ambushes, losing thousands more men. The army's morale plummeted. They were starving, freezing, and exhausted. Many began to believe their leader had led them on a mad journey to their doom. Hannibal was everywhere at once. He marched with the infantry, he scouted the paths, he personally directed the engineers. He shared the dangers and the hardships. His own iron will the only thing holding the army together. There is a famous story, likely embellished by Livy, of how the army's path was blocked by a massive rockfall. Unable to go around it, Hannibal ordered his men to build a huge bonfire against the rock. Once it was red hot, they doused it with sour wine, or more likely cold water, causing the rock to crack and shatter from the thermal shock, allowing them to clear a path. After 9 days of agonizing ascent, they reached the summit. Hannibal gathered his weary, frostbitten survivors. He pointed east, to where the hazy, distant plains of northern Italy were just visible. "Soldiers," he declared, "you are now climbing the walls not of Italy but of Rome itself. All that lies before you is yours for the taking." These words breathed new life into the men. But the descent proved even more dangerous than the climb, on narrow, icy paths where a single misstep meant certain death. When the army finally stumbled out of the mountains into the Pa Valley, it was a ghost of the force that had left Spain. Of the 50,000 who began the journey, barely 26,000 remained. He had lost almost half his army without even fighting a single Roman. But he had achieved the impossible. He was in Italy, and the terror he brought with him was worth more than all the soldiers he had lost. The army that emerged into the plains of Italy was a horrifying sight, less a conquering host and more a procession of skeletal survivors. The soldiers were emaciated, their faces gaunt from starvation and blackened by frostbite. Their clothes were in tatters, their equipment battered and broken from the descent. The once mighty war elephants that had survived were starving and weak. Hannibal had achieved the impossible, but the price was etched on the face of every one of his men. He had started the crossing with over 38,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry. Now, the historian Polybius, our most reliable source, states he had just 12,000 African infantry, 8,000 Spanish infantry, and a maximum of 6,000 cavalry remaining. He had paid for his strategic surprise with the blood and bodies of half his army. His immediate situation was precarious in the extreme. He was deep in enemy territory with a shattered force, and his grand strategy depended entirely on recruiting the local Gallic tribes to his cause. But the Gauls of the Po Valley, who had been eagerly awaiting his arrival, were shocked by what they saw. They had expected a powerful liberator, a mighty Carthaginian army. Instead, they saw a column of walking ghosts. Their initial enthusiasm quickly cooled into cautious neutrality. They offered no immediate aid, no fresh recruits, no supplies. They chose to wait and see if this spectral army would be swiftly annihilated by the Romans. Hannibal understood that he had one chance, and one chance only, to prove his strength. Hesitation now would be fatal. He rested his men and animals for a few days, allowing them to recover their strength on the first green pastures they had seen in weeks. Then, he acted with the decisiveness that would define his entire campaign. He needed to make an example, to send a clear and brutal message to all the tribes of northern Italy. He was not a weakling to be pitied, but a powerful force to be feared and respected. He chose as his target the tribe of the Taurini, who were hostile to his new potential allies, the Insubres. He marched on their chief town, the site of modern-day Turin, and demanded their submission and an alliance. When the Taurini refused, he unleashed the full fury of his veteran army. The assault was swift and merciless. After a 3-day siege, the city was stormed, and Hannibal ordered a general massacre. The slaughter was a calculated act of political terror. The news of it spread like wildfire through the Po Valley. The message was unmistakable. You could either join Hannibal and share in his victories, or you could stand against him and face complete annihilation. The effect was immediate. Terrified and impressed in equal measure, Gallic tribes from all across the region began to flock to his camp, offering supplies and, most importantly, thousands of fresh, fierce warriors to swell the ranks of his depleted army. With one brutal act, Hannibal had secured his base of operations and begun to rebuild his strength. Meanwhile, Publius Cornelius Scipio had landed at Pisa and taken command of the Roman forces in northern Italy. He was shocked to learn that Hannibal had not only survived the Alps but was already active and recruiting allies. Still underestimating his opponent, believing he was facing a mere remnant of an army, Scipio crossed the Po River and marched west to confront him. He was supremely confident. He would find this rabble of exhausted Carthaginians and Gauls and wipe them from the face of the earth, ending the war before it had truly begun. Hannibal, his army now rested and reinforced, was equally eager for a confrontation. He needed a victory against a Roman army to cement his alliance with the Gauls and prove that his promises of liberation were not empty words. He addressed his men, not with a speech of empty platitudes, but with a stark and powerful demonstration. He brought out a group of captured mountain tribesmen, who had been deliberately starved and beaten. He then offered them a choice. They could either be killed, or they could fight each other to the death in single combat. The winner would receive a horse, a fine set of armor, and his freedom. The captured warriors eagerly accepted, each man fighting with ferocious courage for the chance to escape his misery. When the duels were over, Hannibal turned to his own soldiers. "You see before you," he said, "an image of your own condition. You are trapped. Behind you are the Alps. Before you is the Roman army. You must either conquer or die. But if you conquer, the prize is not a single horse, but the entire wealth of Rome. The message electrified his army. He had forged them back into a confident, deadly fighting force. The ghost army was a ghost no longer. It was a dagger, poised and ready to strike its first blow into the flesh of the Republic. The two armies moved cautiously across the plains of Lombardy, each commander seeking to understand the nature of the force he was about to face. Publius Scipio, having crossed the Po River and then its tributary, the Ticinus, was probing forward. He still clung to the belief that his opponent was leading a fragile coalition, weakened by the Alpine crossing. He led his reconnaissance himself, taking with him his entire cavalry force and a contingent of javelin-armed light infantry, the Velites. His intention was to make contact, brush aside the Carthaginian scouts, and gauge the enemy's strength before committing his main force of heavy infantry. Hannibal was equally eager for this first contact. He knew his cavalry was the sharpest tool in his arsenal, far superior to its Roman counterpart in both quality and numbers. He needed a quick, decisive victory to shatter Roman confidence and, more importantly, to prove to his wavering Gallic allies that he was the winning side. He rode out from his camp with his best horsemen, the heavy armored Spanish and Celtic cavalry in the center, and his secret weapon, the swift and deadly Numidians, positioned on the flanks. The two forces spotted each other unexpectedly on the flat plains near the Ticinus River. The clash was immediate. Scipio arranged his forces in a conventional Roman manner, placing his javelin men in the front to skirmish with the enemy before his cavalry charged. It was a textbook maneuver, but Hannibal's cavalry was not a textbook opponent. The Carthaginian heavy cavalry charged forward with such speed and ferocity that the Roman Velites had time to unleash only a single scattered volley before they were overrun. The horsemen crashed through their ranks, cutting them down before they could retreat behind their own cavalry lines. In the center, the Roman cavalry met the charge of Hannibal's Spanish and Celtic horsemen, and a swirling, desperate melee began. But while the Roman commander was focused on the head-on collision, Hannibal's true plan unfolded on the wings. His Numidian cavalry, the masters of fluid movement, did not engage directly. Instead, they galloped wide, easily outflanking the Roman formation. In two swift, coordinated movements, they swept around the battle and slammed into the sides and rear of the embattled Roman cavalry. The effect was devastating. The Romans, now trapped and attacked from three directions, broke in utter panic. What had been an orderly reconnaissance mission turned into a rout. In the chaos, the consul Scipio was seriously wounded and unhorsed. Surrounded by the enemy, he was on the verge of being killed or captured, a disaster that could have ended the war then and there. According to the Roman historian Livy, he was saved by an act of incredible filial devotion. His 17-year-old son, also named Publius Cornelius Scipio, the boy who would one day be known as Scipio Africanus, saw his father's plight, spurred his horse, and charged alone into the heart of the melee, scattering the attackers and dragging his wounded father to safety. The Battle of the Ticinus was a small affair in terms of the numbers involved, but its consequences were immense. Militarily, it was a sharp, humiliating defeat for Rome. Hannibal had demonstrated with brutal clarity the overwhelming superiority of his cavalry. Scipio, wounded and chastened, now understood the grave nature of the threat he faced. This was no weakened remnant. This was a professional army led by a tactical genius. His confidence shattered, Scipio's only thought was to preserve his army. He immediately ordered a full retreat, pulling his forces back across the Po River and destroying the bridges behind him to prevent pursuit. But the most significant impact was political. The Gauls, who had been watching from the sidelines, had seen all they needed to. They had witnessed a Roman consul on Roman soil, defeated and put to flight by the Carthaginian newcomer. The spell of Roman invincibility was broken. That very night, some 2,000 Gallic auxiliaries serving in the Roman army deserted, slaughtering the Roman soldiers in their tents before crossing the river to join Hannibal's camp, bringing with them the heads of the men they had killed as a sign of their new allegiance. This was the first crack in the foundation of Roman power that Hannibal had come to shatter. His victory, though small, was the proof his strategy needed. It was a potent recruiting poster, written in Roman blood. Now wounded and on the defensive, Scipio retreated further, taking up a strong position on the high ground by the Trebia River, awaiting the arrival of his consular colleague and his fresh legions. The stage was now set for the first major battle of the war. The wounded and cautious Scipio was no longer alone. The Roman Senate, alarmed by the defeat at the Ticinus, had dispatched the other consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, ordering him to march his army north from Sicily to join his beleaguered colleague. Longus arrived full of confidence and ambition. He was Scipio's opposite in every way: impetuous, aggressive, and hungry for personal glory. His consular term was nearing its end, and he saw in Hannibal the perfect opportunity to win a glorious triumph before returning to Rome as a hero. He viewed Scipio's newfound caution not as prudence born from hard experience, but as the timidity of a defeated man, perhaps even jealousy. Hannibal, from his camp across the Trebia River, watched these developments with keen interest. He was a master student of his opponents, and in Longus, he saw the perfect instrument for his own designs. He knew the Roman consul's arrogance and ambition were weaknesses to be exploited. He needed to engineer a decisive battle on his own terms, and Longus was the key. Hannibal's plan was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, designed to turn every Roman strength, their discipline, their eagerness to fight, into a fatal flaw. The first part of his plan was to find the perfect location for an ambush. In the dead of night, Hannibal personally rode out with his senior commanders to scout the terrain. He found what he was looking for: a steep, overgrown gully, hidden by brambles and flanking the flat plains where a battle would likely be fought. It was the perfect place to hide a body of troops. He returned to camp and handpicked 2,000 of his best men, 1,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry, placing them under the command of his youngest brother, Mago. He gave them simple instructions: hide in the gully before dawn and do not move or make a sound until you receive the signal to attack. The second part of the plan was to ensure his own army was at peak strength while the enemy was at its weakest. On the bitterly cold morning of December 22nd, with a light snow falling, Hannibal ordered his men to wake late, eat a hot breakfast, and gather around roaring fires. He then had them rub their bodies with olive oil, a common practice to insulate the skin and keep the muscles supple in the cold. His army would go into battle warm, well-fed, and prepared for the elements. With all his pieces in place, he set the trap in motion. At dawn, he sent his Numidian cavalry across the freezing river with orders to ride right up to the Roman fortifications, hurl their javelins, and shout insults, doing everything possible to provoke the hot-headed consul. Longus reacted exactly as Hannibal had predicted. Enraged by the audacity of the attack, he immediately ordered his entire army, nearly 40,000 men, to form up and give chase. He did not give them time to eat. He did not give them time to prepare for the cold. He wanted battle, and he wanted it now. The first stage of the Roman army's destruction was the river itself. To engage Hannibal, they had to wade chest-deep through the icy waters of the Trebia. They emerged on the far bank into the freezing morning air, completely soaked, numb with cold, and already exhausted. Many of the soldiers could barely grip their weapons in their frozen hands. And it was in this state, shivering, starving, and half-frozen, that they were met by the warm, rested, and waiting Carthaginian army. Hannibal arrayed his forces with his less reliable Gallic infantry in the center, knowing they would bear the brunt of the Roman assault. His veteran Spanish and African infantry were placed on their flanks, and his superior cavalry and remaining elephants were positioned on the wings. The battle began. The Roman legionaries, despite their horrific condition, fought with the stubborn courage that was their trademark. The sheer weight of their heavy infantry began to push Hannibal's Gallic center backward. From the Roman perspective, it looked as if they were winning. Longus, seeing the center give way, likely believed his triumph was at hand. But this was exactly what Hannibal wanted. As the Romans pushed deeper into the center, their formation became compressed and their flanks exposed. At that moment, Hannibal gave the signal. His cavalry and elephants charged on both wings, smashing into and routing the smaller Roman cavalry force. Then, instead of pursuing, they wheeled inward and crashed into the unprotected sides of the Roman legions. The legionaries, now being attacked from the front and both sides, were suddenly in a desperate fight for survival. And then the final, fatal blow fell. From the hidden gully behind them, Mago's 2,000 men erupted with a roar, slamming into the Roman rear. The Roman army, now completely surrounded and attacked from all four directions, disintegrated. It was no longer a battle. It was a massacre. Trapped, panicked, and exhausted, the legionaries were cut down by the thousands. Only one part of the Roman line survived intact. The 10,000 veteran legionaries in the center, who had been so relentlessly pushing forward, managed to punch straight through the Carthaginian lines and escape the encirclement, retreating in good order. But the rest of the army, nearly 30,000 men, was either killed on the field or drowned trying to flee back across the frozen river. It was a catastrophic defeat. For the second time, a Roman consular army had been shattered. All of northern Italy was now Hannibal's. The Gauls, seeing this overwhelming proof of his power, threw their full support behind him. And in Rome, the news was received with shock and disbelief. A dark, terrifying new chapter of the war had begun. The news of the Trebia disaster sent a wave of shock and terror through Rome. 2 consular armies had been defeated, and a Carthaginian general was now wintering with a massive army of Gauls in northern Italy. But Rome did not know how to yield. Its response was to double down. New elections were held, and 2 new consuls were chosen for the year 217 BC, Gnaeus Servilius Geminus and Gaius Flaminius. Flaminius was a controversial figure. He was a new man, a populist politician who had risen to power by championing the cause of the common people against the aristocratic Senate. He was immensely popular, energetic, and supremely self-confident. He was also arrogant and deeply contemptuous of the Senate's authority and traditions, including its religious rites. He saw the defeats of the previous year as the result of incompetence and aristocratic dithering. He was determined to find Hannibal and destroy him, securing all the glory for himself. As spring arrived, the 2 new Roman armies took up defensive positions, blocking the main road south into central Italy. They expected Hannibal to march along the predictable routes. But Hannibal's entire strategy was built on defying expectations. He once again chose the path deemed impossible. To bypass the Roman armies, he decided to lead his men on a 4-day march directly through the treacherous Arno marshes. The journey was a nightmare, perhaps even worse than the Alps. The soldiers waded for days through chest-deep water and mud, with nowhere to rest but on the corpses of pack animals that had fallen. Disease ran rampant. Many men died from exhaustion and infection, and many of the precious horses were lost. Hannibal himself, riding on the last surviving elephant, contracted a severe eye infection, likely ophthalmia. The infection was so bad that he would eventually lose all sight in his right eye. He emerged from the marshes permanently scarred, a one-eyed general, but he had once again achieved complete strategic surprise, placing his army in the heart of Etruria, in the rear of Flaminius's army. Now the psychological game began anew. Hannibal knew his opponent. He knew Flaminius was an impatient politician, eager for a decisive battle to bolster his reputation. So, Hannibal began a deliberate campaign of provocation. He unleashed his army on the rich, fertile farmlands of Etruria, one of the wealthiest regions in Italy. His soldiers burned farms, slaughtered livestock, and plundered villages, creating a pillar of smoke that was clearly visible from Flaminius's camp. The message was a direct challenge to the consul's authority and honor. "You see this? I am destroying your land, and you are powerless to stop me." Flaminius's officers and the senators in his camp urged caution. They advised him to wait for his colleague Servilius to arrive with the other consular army, to shadow Hannibal but avoid a pitched battle, the very strategy that would later be perfected by Fabius Maximus. Flaminius would hear none of it. He was incandescent with rage. Accusing his advisors of cowardice, he ordered his army to break camp and pursue the Carthaginians immediately. He would not stand by while Italy burned. He would have his battle. Hannibal was leading him on a leash. He marched his army slowly, tauntingly, allowing the Romans to close the distance. All the while, his scouts were searching for the perfect terrain for the trap he planned to spring. He found it along the northern shore of Lake Trasimene. Here, the road was forced into a narrow defile, a flat plain bounded on the south by the lake itself, and on the north by a line of steep forest-covered hills. It was a natural kill box. The entrance to the defile was a narrow gorge, and the exit was blocked by a large hill at the end of the plain. Under the cover of night, Hannibal meticulously arranged his army. He sent his best heavy infantry, the Spanish and Africans, to block the exit of the defile, hiding them on the hill at the far end. Along the entire length of the hills that overlooked the road, he stationed the rest of his army in a long hidden line. His light infantry and his Gallic allies were concealed in the forests on the slopes, ready to charge down upon the Roman column. His cavalry was hidden in the folds of the terrain near the entrance, ready to sweep in and seal the trap shut once the entire Roman army was inside. At dawn on June 21st, the Roman army began its march. A thick, heavy mist rose from the lake, blanketing the plain but leaving the tops of the hills clear. It was a freak weather event that played perfectly into Hannibal's hands. The Romans could not see the slopes above them. Flaminius, eager to catch his enemy, did not send scouts ahead. He marched his army of 30,000 men into the narrow pass in a long, straggling column, a marching formation, not a battle formation. They were utterly blind to the fact that tens of thousands of enemy soldiers were watching their every move from the heights above, waiting in silent anticipation. When the rear of the Roman column had passed through the entrance gorge, Hannibal gave the signal. A trumpet blast cut through the morning mist. All along the length of the hills, the hidden Carthaginian army rose as one and charged down the slopes with terrifying war cries. From the front, the Spanish and African infantry blocked the Roman escape. From the rear, Hannibal's cavalry charged in, sealing the entrance. And from the long northern flank, thousands of Gauls and light infantry crashed into the side of the unprepared Roman column. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The Romans, caught completely by surprise, had no time to form a battle line. They were attacked from three sides while trapped in marching order. Panic was instantaneous and absolute. Units were cut off and annihilated before they could even draw their swords. The mist created chaos, with legionaries unable to see their own standards or hear the commands of their officers. Many soldiers, weighed down by their heavy armor, tried to flee into the lake, only to be cut down by cavalry or drown in the water. The consul, Gaius Flaminius, fought bravely, trying to rally his men, until a Gallic warrior recognized him and speared him to death, avenging past Roman campaigns against his people. In just 3 hours, the Roman army ceased to exist. 15,000 Romans were killed on the field. Another 15,000 were taken prisoner. Hannibal had annihilated a second consular army, and this time almost no one escaped. The road to Rome now lay open. The news of the slaughter at Lake Trasimene struck Rome like a thunderbolt. For days, wild rumors flew through the city, but the Senate, paralyzed by the scale of the disaster, remained silent. Finally, the praetor, a senior magistrate, mounted the rostra in the forum. He looked out over the terrified crowd and uttered a single chilling phrase, "Pugna magna victi summus." We have been defeated in a great battle. The city erupted in a display of public grief and panic unlike any in its history. The wailing of women echoed through the streets as every family wondered if their sons, brothers, and husbands were among the dead. The road to Rome was open. There were no more legions standing between Hannibal and the city walls. The people expected to see the dreaded Carthaginian cavalry appear on the horizon at any moment. But Hannibal did not come. He marched his army past the city, heading east towards the Adriatic coast and then turning south. To the terrified Romans, this move was incomprehensible. To Hannibal, it was the logical execution of his grand strategy. He knew that even if he could somehow storm the heavily fortified city, he could never hold it. His goal was not to occupy a single city, but to dismantle an entire system of power. The victory at Trasimene was not an end in itself. It was a tool, a powerful piece of propaganda in the larger political war he was waging. Now he put that tool to use. He had thousands of prisoners in his custody. He began a process of careful separation. The Roman prisoners were treated harshly. They were bound, given meager rations, and held for a potential ransom that Hannibal knew the Roman Senate would refuse to pay, further demonstrating their arrogance. But the prisoners from Rome's Italian allies, Samnites, Umbrians, Etruscans, were treated with remarkable kindness. They were fed, their wounds were tended to, and then Hannibal gathered them together. He stood before them not as a conqueror, but as a benefactor. He told them he had no quarrel with them. His war was not against the peoples of Italy. His war was with Rome and Rome alone. He had come, he claimed, as a liberator, to free them from the shackles of Roman domination. Then he set them all free without ransom to return to their homes. This was an act of profound strategic genius. Every freed prisoner became a walking, talking testament to Hannibal's message. They returned to their cities and towns, telling stories not of a brutal foreign invader, but of a powerful and magnanimous general who was fighting for their freedom. Hannibal was attempting to hack the source code of Roman power. He was driving a political wedge between Rome and its allies, transforming the conflict from Rome versus Carthage into Rome versus a liberated Italy, led by Hannibal. He was planting thousands of seeds of rebellion, hoping they would sprout and deprive Rome of the manpower that was its lifeblood. As he marched south into the rich lands of Apulia and Samnium, his army recovered and re-equipped itself. The soldiers stripped the armor and weapons from the dead of Flaminius's army. For the first time, Hannibal's veteran African infantry were armed in the Roman style, with the short gladius and the heavy scutum. They were not just defeating the legions, they were becoming a dark mirror of them. His march was slow and deliberate. He was a constant, terrifying presence, demonstrating to the peoples of southern Italy that the Roman state was powerless to protect them. Yet, for the moment, his political strategy yielded few immediate results. The allies in central Italy, bound to Rome for centuries by treaties, shared culture, and fear, remained loyal. They had seen Hannibal win battles, but they had also seen Rome's immense power and its unforgiving nature. Betraying Rome was a gamble most were not yet willing to take. Hannibal understood this. He knew that one more victory, one more cataclysmic destruction of a Roman army, was needed to shatter the last vestiges of fear and awe that held the Italian Confederation together. He needed to prove beyond any doubt that allegiance to Rome was a losing proposition. The political war was being waged, but it had to be won on the battlefield. And so, as he moved through the south, he sought to create the conditions for that one final, decisive battle that would bring the Roman system crashing down. The annihilation of Flaminius's army at Lake Trasimene plunged Rome into an existential crisis. The Republic was on its knees. In this moment of supreme peril, the normal functions of government were suspended. The Senate turned to a constitutional emergency measure reserved for times of ultimate danger: the appointment of a dictator. This was not a tyrant in the modern sense, but a single magistrate entrusted with absolute supreme authority for a term of 6 months, tasked with one goal: to save the state. The man they chose was Quintus Fabius Maximus. Fabius was the antithesis of the consuls Hannibal had faced so far. He was old, experienced, and deeply traditional. Where Longus and Flaminius had been impulsive and glory-seeking, Fabius was patient, methodical, and utterly unflappable. He had carefully studied Hannibal's victories and had come to a simple, chilling, and deeply un-Roman conclusion. In a pitched battle, Hannibal was invincible. His tactical genius was on a level no Roman commander could match. To seek a decisive engagement with him was not bravery. It was suicide. Therefore, the only way to win was to refuse to play his game. Fabius instituted a new, radical strategy that would become immortalized with his name. The Fabian strategy was a war of attrition, a war of shadows. His plan was to avoid a general engagement at all costs. Instead, the Roman army would become a constant, menacing presence, shadowing Hannibal's every move. Fabius would keep his legions on high ground, in the hills and foothills where Hannibal's superior cavalry, his greatest weapon, was ineffective. From these secure positions, he would wage a war of 1,000 cuts. He sent out small raiding parties to attack Carthaginian foragers and scouting parties. He cut off their supply lines, harassed their stragglers, and created a permanent zone of danger around Hannibal's camp. His strategy was based on a profound understanding of Hannibal's fundamental weakness. Hannibal was an invader in a foreign land. He had no reliable supply base, no major ports, and no steady stream of reinforcements from Carthage. His army had to live off the land. By denying him the ability to forage freely, Fabius was attacking his enemy's stomach. Fabius knew that time was Rome's greatest ally. Every day that passed without a decisive victory was a small defeat for Hannibal. His veteran army would slowly be weakened by skirmishes, sickness, and hunger, while Rome, with its vast reserves of allied manpower, could afford to wait. Hannibal immediately recognized the danger of this new approach. It was a strategy he could not counter with tactical brilliance. He tried every trick he knew to lure Fabius into a battle. He marched his army through the most fertile and wealthy regions of Italy, like the famed vineyards of Campania, burning and plundering everything in his path. This was a calculated psychological attack. He was demonstrating to Rome's allies that their protector, Fabius, was either unable or unwilling to defend them. He hoped to either shame Fabius into fighting, or to convince the allies to defect out of sheer desperation. But Fabius would not take the bait. He watched the smoke rise from the burning fields, endured the insults, and kept his army in the hills. On one occasion, Fabius's patience nearly paid off. He managed to trap Hannibal's entire army in a valley, blocking the only pass. For a moment, it seemed the war was over. But here, Hannibal's cunning shone through. That night, he gathered 2,000 captured oxen. He ordered his men to tie bundles of dry wood and torches to their horns. As darkness fell, the torches were lit, and the terrified animals were driven up the slopes of the hills adjacent to the pass. The Roman soldiers guarding the pass saw the hundreds of bobbing lights moving in the darkness and panicked, thinking it was the main Carthaginian army attempting a flanking maneuver. They abandoned their post to intercept the phantom force, leaving the pass unguarded. While the Romans were chasing cattle, Hannibal quietly marched his entire army, men, cavalry, and baggage train, out of the trap unscathed. While this strategy was militarily brilliant, it was a political disaster in Rome. The Roman people and many senators saw it as cowardice. They were a people built on the glory of conquest, not the shame of evasion. Fabius was publicly mocked, his name twisted into a new insulting nickname, Cunctator the Delayer. His own second-in-command, Marcus Minucius Rufus, openly criticized his inaction and agitated for a more aggressive approach. The pressure grew to an unbearable level. The Roman spirit could not tolerate this war of shadows. They craved a return to the old ways: a massive army, a glorious battle, and a decisive victory. As Fabius's 6-month term as dictator came to an end, the stage was set for Rome to abandon his cautious strategy. The Republic, tired of delaying, was about to choose a path of total confrontation that would lead it directly to its darkest day. The political backlash against Fabius the Delayer was immense. His strategy, while militarily sound, was an affront to the Roman soul. By the end of his dictatorship, the city was united in its desire for a return to glorious, decisive warfare. The popular mood was perfectly captured in the consular elections for the year 216 BC. The Roman people elected 2 men who represented the opposite poles of their society, a partnership that was destined for disaster. One consul was Lucius Aemilius Paulus. He was a seasoned aristocrat, a veteran commander from a distinguished family. He had fought successful campaigns in Illyria and was a supporter of Fabius's cautious approach. He understood the danger Hannibal posed and believed that a direct confrontation was a terrible risk. He represented the caution and experience of the old Roman elite. His colleague, however, was Gaius Terentius Varro. Varro was the complete opposite. He was a new man of humble origins, rumored to be the son of a butcher. He was a fiery populist demagogue, a politician who had ridden the wave of popular discontent to the consulship. He was the champion of the common people, and he openly mocked the cautious strategies of Fabius and the aristocracy as cowardice. He promised the people what they wanted to hear: that he would not delay, that he would seek out Hannibal, and that he would crush him in one glorious battle. His campaign slogan was essentially, "No more Fabian tactics." Varro represented the raw, aggressive, and often reckless spirit of the Roman mob. Under the immense pressure of Varro and the popular will, the Senate made an unprecedented decision. They would not just raise a standard consular army, they would create the largest single military force in the history of the Republic. They authorized the raising of not 4, but 8 legions, a number never before fielded at once. Furthermore, each legion would be reinforced to its maximum strength. Combined with the large contingents from Rome's allies, the total force numbered close to 87,000 men, roughly 80,000 infantry and over 6,000 cavalry. It was a doomsday army, a sledgehammer forged for a single purpose: to find Hannibal's much smaller force of around 50,000 and annihilate it through sheer, overwhelming numbers. Rome was putting all its chips on the table. The command structure of this massive force was a uniquely Roman recipe for disaster. Command was not given to a single supreme general. Instead, it rotated daily between the 2 consuls. One day, the cautious and experienced Paulus would be in charge. The next, the reckless and glory-seeking Varro would have absolute authority. The 2 men despised each other, their personalities and military philosophies in complete opposition. Paulus urged caution, advising that they fight on hilly terrain to neutralize Hannibal's cavalry. Varro accused him of being a coward, eager to find any flat plain where the legions could deploy and charge. Hannibal could not have designed a more dysfunctional command system for his enemies if he had tried. In the early summer of 216 BC, this colossal army marched south. Paulus and Varro located Hannibal's army near a small supply depot on the Aufidus River, in a region of Apulia known as Cannae. The terrain was a wide, flat, sun-baked plain, perfect cavalry country. It was the battlefield Hannibal had been dreaming of. Paulus, recognizing the danger, was horrified. He argued for repositioning the army, for drawing Hannibal into the hills. Varro, whose turn to command was approaching, saw his chance for glory. He argued that the plain was the perfect place to deploy their superior numbers and crush the enemy. The Roman soldiers themselves, confident in their overwhelming strength, were eager for a fight. They could see the Carthaginian camp, could see how badly they outnumbered them. They taunted their cautious commander, Paulus, and cheered for Varro. The pressure on Paulus was immense. The final argument came when Varro's command day arrived. He declared his intention to offer battle immediately. Paulus could either assent or risk being accused of mutiny and cowardice. He pleaded with his colleague one last time, warning him that he was leading Rome to its doom. But it was no use. The decision was made. The legions were ordered to form up for battle on the flat plain. The greatest army Rome had ever assembled was marching willingly into the greatest trap ever devised. The morning of August 2nd, 216 BC, broke hot and dusty over the flat plains of Apulia. A dry wind, the Vulturnus, blew across the field, carrying clouds of dust from the Carthaginian camp into the faces of the Romans, stinging their eyes and obscuring their vision. This was Varro's day of command, and he intended to make it a day of historic victory. On his orders, the largest army Rome had ever fielded began to deploy for battle. The spectacle must have been terrifying in its scale. Nearly 80,000 Roman and allied infantry forming up, their bronze helmets and chest plates glinting under the rising sun, a seemingly endless forest of shields and spears. Their confidence was absolute. They outnumbered Hannibal's infantry by nearly 2-1. Today, they believed, Roman numbers and Roman courage would crush the clever Carthaginian once and for all. Varro's plan was the epitome of Roman strategic thinking. Simple, direct, and brutal. He believed that Hannibal's previous victories had come from trickery and the superiority of his cavalry on the flanks. His solution was to make the flanks irrelevant by creating a central force so powerful it would be unstoppable. He modified the traditional legionary formation. Instead of arranging the maniples in their usual flexible checkerboard pattern, he ordered them to be packed tightly together. He made his army's formation much deeper and narrower than normal. It was no longer a flexible line of swordsmen. It was a single, colossal human battering ram designed to do one thing: smash through the enemy center with one irresistible, overwhelming blow. On the wings, he placed his cavalry. The weaker Roman citizen cavalry, commanded by the reluctant consul Paulus, held the right flank closer to the river. The more numerous and reliable allied cavalry held the open left flank, likely under the direct command of Varro himself. Across the field, Hannibal watched the Roman behemoth take shape. He had a little over 40,000 infantry and 10,000 of his superb cavalry. To face the Roman battering ram head-on would be annihilation. He knew he could not win a battle of brute force. He had to win a battle of wits. The formation he deployed was a work of tactical genius, a masterpiece of deception designed to turn Rome's greatest strength, its massive deep center, into its fatal weakness. At the very center of his line, directly in the path of the Roman ram, he placed his weakest and least reliable troops, the Spanish and Gallic mercenaries. This was a move of incredible audacity and risk. If these men broke and fled too early, his entire army would be routed. But he did not form them in a straight line. Instead, he pushed them forward into a convex crescent, a shallow arc that bulged outward toward the Romans. This was the bait. The purpose of this crescent was to engage the Romans first, to absorb their initial charge, and then to begin a slow, controlled fighting withdrawal. The crescent was designed to bend backward under pressure, to gradually invert from a convex bulge into a concave pocket, a deep sack. This planned retreat was meant to do one thing: lure the charging legions deeper and deeper into the heart of his formation, pulling them forward with the intoxicating scent of victory. While this weak center prepared to give way, the true strength of his army lay hidden in plain sight on the flanks. Positioned behind and to the sides of the crescent, in deep solid columns, stood his finest troops, the veteran African infantry. These were the hardened survivors of the Trebia and Trasimene, now armed in the Roman style. They stood motionless, like the two powerful jaws of a trap, waiting for the Roman legions to rush into the space between them. They were the anvil upon which the Roman hammer would be broken. Finally, Hannibal deployed his decisive weapon, his cavalry. On his left flank, facing the weaker Roman cavalry under Paulus, he placed his elite heavy cavalry, the Spanish and Celtic horsemen, under the command of his best cavalry officer, Hasdrubal, not to be confused with his brother in Spain. Their orders were simple and brutal. Charge, shatter your opponents as quickly as possible, and then get back into the battle. On his right flank, facing the stronger allied Roman cavalry, he placed his untouchable Numidian light horsemen. Their task was different. They were not to seek a quick, decisive victory. Their job was to skirmish, to harass, to feign retreats, and to keep the allied cavalry occupied for as long as possible, effectively pinning them in place and preventing them from helping the Roman infantry. The two armies now stood facing each other, a perfect contrast of philosophies. Rome, a massive, dense sledgehammer, built for a single powerful blow. Carthage, a flexible, multi-layered, and deceptive web, with a deliberately weak center designed to lure the hammer in, and powerful flanks ready to envelop and destroy it. Hannibal was staking everything on the discipline of his men to execute a complex, phased battle plan, and on the predictable, arrogant aggression of the Roman consul. The trap was set. The bait was laid. The Roman legions, chanting their war cries and deaf to the warnings of their more experienced commanders, began their ponderous advance, ready to step into the jaws of history's most perfect ambush. The battle began with a chaotic skirmish of the light troops, but the true engagement started when the massive Roman infantry block began its inexorable advance. It was a terrifying sight, a tidal wave of men and shields, 80,000 strong, moving forward with the thunder of sandals on the dusty plain. The target was the thin, bulging crescent of Gauls and Spaniards in Hannibal's center. The Roman legions crashed into this line with the force of a physical impact, and a horrific melee erupted. The screams of men and the clash of steel filled the air as the front ranks engaged in a desperate, brutal struggle. Just as Hannibal had planned, his weak center began to give way under the immense pressure. But it did not break. With incredible discipline, the Gauls and Spaniards began a slow, fighting retreat. Step by step, they were pushed backward. The convex crescent first flattened, and then began to buckle inward, forming the concave pocket Hannibal had envisioned. The Roman legionaries, sensing victory, roared in triumph. They pressed their advantage relentlessly, losing all formation as they surged forward, each man eager to be the first to break the enemy line. The consuls Varro and Paulus, caught in the heart of the infantry struggle, urged their men on. They were driving a wedge deep into the heart of the Carthaginian army, just as Varro had planned. The human battering ram was working. They were winning. But they weren't. While the Roman infantry was being lured into the sack, the decisive actions were happening on the flanks. On Hannibal's left, his heavy Spanish and Celtic cavalry, led by Hasdrubal, launched a furious charge. They smashed into the weaker Roman citizen cavalry with unstoppable force. The fight was short and brutal. It was not a contest, but an execution. The Roman cavalry was shattered, and the consul Aemilius Paulus was wounded in the chaos. Hasdrubal, however, demonstrated an act of breathtaking battlefield discipline. He did not allow his victorious horsemen to pursue the fleeing survivors. Instead, he rallied them and led them on a wide arc behind the entire Roman army. Meanwhile, on the other flank, Hannibal's Numidians were performing their own deadly dance. They engaged the more numerous Roman allied cavalry, but refused to commit to a full-scale melee. They skirmished, threw their javelins, feigned retreats to lure the Romans forward, and then wheeled around to strike their flanks. They were a maddening, untouchable swarm, and their purpose was simply to hold the allied cavalry in place, to fix them. As they were doing so, Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry, having completed their ride behind the Roman lines, crashed into their rear. Attacked from the front by the Numidians and from behind by the heavy cavalry, the allied horsemen were also broken and swept from the field. The Roman infantry, still surging forward into Hannibal's collapsing center, was now completely blind and naked, stripped of all its cavalry support. And then the trap snapped shut. Hannibal gave the signal. The two solid columns of his veteran African infantry, who had been standing motionless on the flanks like silent observers, now acted. They pivoted inward by 90 degrees. Like two great fortress gates swinging shut, they advanced and slammed into the exposed flanks of the Roman legions. The Romans, who had been so focused on the pursuit forward, were suddenly hit by ferocious attacks from their left and their right. Their forward momentum halted, and their long column began to be compressed from the sides. In the same moment, the victorious Carthaginian cavalry, now completely unopposed, completed their encirclement and charged into the rear of the Roman infantry. The sack was sealed. The Roman army was now surrounded on all four sides. What had been a battle instantly transformed into a methodical, industrial-scale slaughter. The tens of thousands of Roman soldiers were packed into a shrinking killing field so tightly that many could not even raise their arms to swing their swords. The outer ranks were cut down mercilessly by the Africans and the cavalry. The inner ranks, unable to fight or flee, were crushed to death by the sheer pressure of their own comrades. There was no escape. The wind still blew dust into their faces, the sun beat down upon them, and the screams of the dying were the only sound that mattered. The consul Aemilius Paulus, wounded and bleeding, fought on foot among his men until he was cut down and killed. Gaius Terentius Varro, the architect of the disaster, managed to break free with a small group of horsemen and ignominiously fled the field. For 8 hours the slaughter continued, until the sun began to set on a field that was no longer recognizable. It was a lake of blood, a mound of corpses piled several layers deep. By the end of the day, somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 Roman soldiers lay dead or dying. Hannibal had lost less than 6,000 men, mostly the Gauls who had so bravely formed the bait in his trap. It was the single bloodiest day in Roman history, a military masterpiece, and a human catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Hannibal had not just defeated a Roman army, he had annihilated it. As dusk fell over the corpse-choked plains of Cannae, the scale of Hannibal's victory became terrifyingly clear. The greatest army the Roman Republic had ever put into the field had been erased from existence. In the Carthaginian camp, a grim and methodical accounting of the slaughter began. Hannibal ordered his men to go through the mounds of the dead and collect the symbols of Roman status. From the fingers of the fallen knights and senators, they pulled thousands of gold rings. Livy tells us that a full bushel, some historians say as many as 3, of these golden rings was later dispatched to Carthage, a visceral, tangible proof of the magnitude of the victory. The message was clear. He had not just killed Roman soldiers, he had decapitated its ruling class. 80 senators, nearly a third of the entire Roman Senate, lay dead on the field, alongside countless other nobles and officials. It was in this moment of absolute triumph, surrounded by the spoils of his masterpiece, that one of the most famous and debated conversations in military history took place. Maharbal, Hannibal's brilliant cavalry commander and one of the chief architects of the day's victory, approached his general. His blood was still up, his mind alight with the possibilities now open to them. "Let me go on at once with the cavalry," he urged Hannibal. "Follow me, and in 5 days, you will dine on the Capitoline Hill in Rome." The road was open. The city was defenseless. The psychological blow of Cannae would surely shatter any will to resist. But Hannibal hesitated. The proposal was tempting, but his mind, always calculating, saw the immense difficulties. His army, though victorious, was exhausted after 8 hours of brutal combat. He had no siege train to break down the massive walls of Rome. He knew the city's population was vast, and that even in their panic, the old men and boys would fight from the barricades. His grand strategy had never been to capture the city itself, but to break the federation of its allies. He believed this catastrophic defeat would be the final proof the Italian peoples needed to abandon Rome and flock to his side. He turned to his eager subordinate and declined. The march on Rome would wait. Maharbal, in a moment of frustration and prophetic insight, is said to have uttered the words that would echo through history and perhaps haunt Hannibal for the rest of his life. "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal," he said, "but you do not know how to use one." Whether this conversation happened exactly as reported is uncertain, but it perfectly encapsulates the great historical question of Cannae. Was this Hannibal's fatal mistake? The one moment where victory in the war was within his grasp, only to be let slip? Or was it a prudent recognition of his own limitations? A refusal to gamble his entire army on a single desperate assault? We will never know. While Hannibal made his fateful decision, the first trickles of news began to reach Rome. At first, it was just panicked rumors brought by a few escaped horsemen. But as more survivors staggered in, the awful truth dawned. The city was plunged into a state of collective hysteria. The defeat at Trasimene had been a shock, but this was an apocalypse. There was not a single family that had not lost someone. The Senate, or what was left of it, had to physically ban public mourning, as the continuous wailing was destroying what little morale remained. Old Fabius Maximus, the Delayer, now saw his hated strategy vindicated in the most terrible way possible. He was one of the few who kept his head, taking control of the city's defenses and restoring a semblance of order. The people, in their terror, expected to see Hannibal's Numidian cavalry cresting the hills at any moment. The cry "Hannibal ad portas," Hannibal at the gates, became a real and present terror. The Republic seemed finished. Its armies were gone. Its leaders were dead. Its spirit seemed broken. Everything now depended on how Rome would respond to its darkest hour. In Rome, the days following Cannae were filled with a primal collective dread. Every citizen, from the highest senator to the lowliest plebeian, expected the gates to be blockaded, the siege engines to be built, and the final assault to begin. The cry "Hannibal at the gates" was not a metaphor. It was an imminent expectation. Yet, the attack never came. The dust settled on the roads leading to the capital, and the dreaded Numidian cavalry never appeared. The question that has echoed through 2 millennia of history was first asked in those terrified whispers. Why? Maharbal's impassioned plea to march on the capital represented the soldier's instinct. Press the attack, strike the enemy's heart while he is reeling. But Hannibal was more than a soldier. He was a grand strategist, and his calculations went far beyond the immediate thrill of victory. From a purely military and logistical standpoint, an assault on Rome was a gargantuan risk. His army, while triumphant, was battered and exhausted. A significant portion of his losses had been among his best Gallic infantry, who had bravely absorbed the initial Roman charge. An immediate 5-day forced march would have further weakened his force before it even reached the city. Furthermore, Rome was not a simple town to be stormed. It was a massive, sprawling metropolis protected by the formidable Servian walls, a defensive line nearly 7 miles long. To besiege such a city required specialized siege engines, catapults, siege towers, battering rams, none of which Hannibal possessed. Constructing them would take weeks, if not months, giving the Romans precious time to regroup, recall scattered legions, and organize a fanatical defense. Hannibal knew that inside those walls were hundreds of thousands of citizens who, however panicked, would fight with the desperation of cornered animals to defend their homes and families. A failed siege would be more than a tactical setback. It would be a catastrophic strategic defeat, shattering the aura of invincibility he had just purchased with so much blood at Cannae. But the most compelling reason for Hannibal's decision was not logistical. It was strategic. It went to the very heart of his theory of the war. His primary objective had never been the physical capture of the city of Rome. His objective was the political dissolution of the Roman Federation. He saw Rome not as a city, but as the head of a powerful body, and that body was its network of allies. His entire campaign, the march over the Alps, the victories at Trebia and Trasimene, was designed to prove to that body that its head was no longer capable of protecting it. Cannae was meant to be the final, irrefutable argument in this political debate. He believed that after such a cataclysm, the Allies would see that Rome was a losing cause and would abandon it. A march on Rome would have been a deviation from this plan. It would have transformed him from a liberator of the Italians into just another foreign conqueror sacking their capital, a move that could have alienated the very people he was trying to win over. And in the weeks and months following Cannae, it seemed his strategy was working perfectly. The dam of the Roman Confederacy finally broke. The news of the annihilation of 80,000 men convinced many of Rome's allies that the end was near. A wave of defections swept across southern Italy. Most of the Samnites, Rome's ancient and bitter rivals, came over to his side. The peoples of Lucania and Bruttium followed suit. But the greatest prize of all was the city of Capua. Capua was the second largest and wealthiest city in all of Italy, a regional capital of immense strategic and symbolic importance. When Capua opened its gates and declared its allegiance to Hannibal, it must have seemed to him that the final victory was at hand. Rome had lost its most powerful ally in the south. Surely others would now follow, and the Republic, deprived of its soldiers and resources, would be forced to sue for peace on Carthaginian terms. This is why Hannibal did not march on Rome. In his mind, he was winning the war he had set out to fight. He chose to march south, to consolidate his gains, to welcome his new allies, and to establish a winter base in the luxurious city of Capua. He was cashing in his military victory for political capital, precisely as he had planned. He believed that Rome, isolated and abandoned, would eventually wither on the vine. From his perspective, attacking the city directly would have been a reckless gamble when his more patient, more elegant strategy was finally bearing fruit. The great irony is that both Hannibal and Maharbal may have been right. Maharbal was right that a singular opportunity to end the war through a knockout blow may have been missed. But Hannibal was also right that such a blow was contrary to his entire strategy and had a high probability of failure. He chose the path of the strategist over the path of the gambler. It was a sound, logical decision that would ultimately be undone not by a flaw in his own reasoning, but by a force he had consistently underestimated: the indomitable, irrational, and unbreakable will of the Roman people to endure. In his new winter headquarters in the luxurious city of Capua, Hannibal waited. He had won the ultimate victory. He had shattered the Roman legions, proven their invincibility to be a myth, and broken their confederation. According to all the known rules of ancient warfare, the next step was for the defeated party to send a delegation to sue for peace. He had shown them the futility of resistance. Now, he waited for the inevitable surrender. The surrender never came. From Rome, only a deafening, defiant silence answered. What was happening in the city was something outside of Hannibal's experience, something that his brilliant strategic mind could not compute. The Roman Republic, in its darkest hour, did not collapse. It did not break. It hardened. The initial wave of panic and grief that had swept the city in the days after Cannae slowly transformed into a cold, silent, and absolute fury. The Roman spirit, forged in centuries of warfare, revealed its true nature: an irrational and unbreakable will to endure, no matter the cost. The Senate, with its ranks decimated, rose to the occasion. Under the steadying influence of old Fabius Maximus, they imposed a draconian order on the city. Public mourning was forbidden. to prevent the collective grief from turning into collective despair. The city gates were closed to stop the flow of panicked refugees. But their most profound decree was a reflection of their new state of mind. The very words peace and ransom were forbidden to be spoken in public. Rome would not negotiate. Rome would not buy back its captured soldiers, viewing them as men who had failed in their duty to conquer or die. The survivors of Cannae who managed to struggle back were stripped of their honors and exiled to Sicily in disgrace, sentenced to serve until the war was won. Then came the mobilization. It was total. The state conscripted every able-bodied male citizen. They lowered the draft age to 17. When that was not enough, they emptied the prisons, offering freedom to criminals in exchange for military service. Finally, they took the most radical and socially taboo step of all. For the first time in their history, the Senate purchased 8,000 slaves from their owners and armed them, forming 2 new legions with the promise of citizenship if they served with courage. To find enough weapons, they stripped the temples of the ancestral trophies taken from past enemies. The entire republic, from its highest aristocrat to its lowest slave, was transformed into a single unified war machine, fueled by a grim and silent determination. This new resolve was accompanied by a return to ancient, brutal religious rites. To restore the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods, which they believed had been broken, the Romans sought human scapegoats. 2 Vestal virgins, priestesses sworn to chastity, were accused of breaking their vows and were buried alive. It was a dark, primitive act, a sign of a society in the grip of terror, but also a society purging itself of perceived weakness and steeling itself for a fight to the death. Militarily, Rome had found its answer to Hannibal's genius, and it was the very strategy they had so recently despised. The Fabian strategy was reinstated as state policy, but this time with a harder edge. There would be no more grand battles in Italy. The war would be a slow, grinding, multi-front struggle. Fabius became the shield of Rome, his cautious strategy denying Hannibal the decisive engagement he craved. And a new, more aggressive commander, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, became the sword of Rome. Marcellus's task was not to defeat Hannibal's main army, but to relentlessly attack his new Italian allies, besieging their cities and punishing them for their betrayal. The new Roman strategy was simple and brutal. Contain the lion in his cage in southern Italy, while systematically slaughtering his cubs all around him. While Hannibal celebrated his victories in Capua, believing he had broken the enemy, he had fundamentally misjudged the nature of his foe. He had won the battle of tactics, but he was about to lose the war of wills. He had expected to fight a state, a rational entity that would surrender when the cost of war became too high. Instead, he had awakened a nation that was now willing to sacrifice its sons, its treasure, its laws, and its very soul for one purpose: the complete and utter destruction of Hannibal Barca. Hannibal's decision to winter his army in Capua after the victory at Cannae became a cornerstone of later Roman propaganda. Historians like Livy would claim that his hardened veterans, exposed to the city's luxurious lifestyle, fine food, wine, and women, grew soft and lost their fighting edge. This narrative of the delights of Capua was a comforting explanation for why Rome eventually survived. But the truth was more complex and far more strategic. The problem was not that Hannibal's army lost its discipline. The problem was that its commander had lost the initiative. The new Roman strategy had fundamentally changed the nature of the war. Hannibal was a master of the decisive battle, but the Romans now refused to offer him one. His army remained the most lethal fighting force in Italy, a lion that no one dared to face in an open field. But a lion, however powerful, is useless if its prey simply stays out of reach. Fabius and the other Roman commanders shadowed his movements, always keeping to the high ground, always refusing to be lured onto a flat plain. The war of grand maneuvers was over. A long, ugly war of attrition had begun. This new reality placed Hannibal in a strategic straitjacket. His new Italian allies, who had flocked to him after Cannae, were a double-edged sword. While they provided him with a base of operations, they were also weak and militarily dependent on him for protection. Roman armies, now operating in multiple independent corps, began to systematically attack these allied cities. This forced Hannibal into a frustrating game of strategic whack-a-mole. If he marched his main army to save one allied city, a Roman force would immediately besiege another 1 mile away. He could not be everywhere at once. He was forced to break his magnificent army into smaller garrisons and detachments to protect his allies, diluting his central striking force. Whenever a Roman general grew bold enough to challenge him, Hannibal's genius still flashed like lightning. In the years following Cannae, he fought and won several more significant battles, destroying 2 more Roman armies in separate engagements. But these victories no longer had the same impact. Rome had learned to absorb losses. The Senate treated the destruction of an army of 15,000 men as an unfortunate but acceptable cost of war. They would simply recruit more soldiers and send a new army into the field. For Hannibal, however, every victory was costly. He could not replace his own losses. His hardened veterans from Spain and Africa were an irreplaceable resource, and with every battle, their numbers dwindled. His isolation was compounded by the situation back in Carthage. The sacks of gold rings and the news of his stunning victories had momentarily silenced his political opponents, but they had not vanished. The faction of wealthy landowners led by Hanno the Great, who had always opposed the Barcid War, argued that Hannibal had won his victory and should now make peace from a position of strength. They were reluctant to send significant reinforcements of men and money, fearing that a total victory would make Hannibal too powerful, a king in all but name. The support that trickled in from Carthage was never enough to replace his losses or to fund a wider campaign. Hannibal was trapped. He was the undisputed master of the battlefield, but he was losing the war of logistics and manpower. He was a lion in a cage, still deadly, still capable of swatting down any keeper who ventured too close, but unable to break free. He was tied down in southern Italy, forced to watch as the Roman military machine slowly and methodically began to regain control, punishing his allies one by one. The war was no longer about a single, decisive blow. It had become a grim, grinding contest of endurance. And it was a contest that Hannibal, cut off and alone on enemy soil, was mathematically destined to lose unless he could find a way to change the equation. His only hope now lay beyond Italy, with the only other source of professional soldiers he had left, his brother's army in Spain. While Hannibal was trapped in his strategic cage in Italy, the long shadow of the war stretched back to its source, the Barcid dominion in Spain. This was Hannibal's power base, the source of his silver and his best troops. As long as Spain remained in Carthaginian hands, there was always a hope that another army, led by his brother Hasdrubal, could march over the Alps and reinforce him. For years, Roman forces in Spain, led by the elder Scipio brothers, had fought a difficult holding action. But after they were both defeated and killed in battle, Rome had to find a new commander for what seemed like a lost cause. The man they chose was the son of one of those slain commanders, the young man who had saved his father at the Ticinus, Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was only 25 years old, technically too young to hold high command, but he was already a charismatic figure, and he volunteered for the seemingly impossible task when no one else would. Scipio was a new breed of Roman leader. He was not a cautious traditionalist like Fabius or a reckless politician like Varro. He was a brilliant, innovative, and deeply thoughtful student of war. And his primary subject of study was Hannibal Barca himself. He had spent years analyzing Hannibal's victories, deconstructing his tactics, and understanding the mind of the man who had brought Rome to its knees. He learned that Hannibal's genius lay in surprise, in speed, in psychological warfare, and in the masterful use of cavalry. Scipio decided that the only way to defeat the master was to become a better student of his own methods. Upon arriving in Spain in 210 BC, he found the Roman army demoralized and on the defensive. 3 separate Carthaginian armies, led by Hannibal's 2 brothers, Hasdrubal and Mago, and another general, were operating in the peninsula. They were confident and controlled most of the territory. A conventional Roman approach would have been to cautiously engage one of these armies. Scipio did the opposite. He did something straight out of Hannibal's playbook. Leaving a small force to screen the enemy armies, he took the bulk of his men on a lightning-fast secret forced march, covering over 300 miles in just 1 week. His target was the heart of Carthaginian power, their capital and main supply base, New Carthage. The city was considered impregnable. It was heavily fortified and protected on 3 sides by the sea and a large lagoon. The Carthaginian commanders, their armies scattered across Spain for the winter, never dreamed it could be attacked. Scipio's army appeared before the walls as if from nowhere, taking the garrison completely by surprise. He launched a diversionary assault on the main gates to fix the defenders' attention. Meanwhile, he acted on a crucial piece of intelligence he had gathered from local fishermen. The lagoon to the west of the city was shallow, and at low tide, it was possible to wade across it. As the tide went out, he sent a hand-picked force of 500 men with ladders across the exposed mudflats. They reached the base of the city's western wall, which the defenders had left almost entirely unguarded, believing it to be protected by the sea. The Romans scaled the wall with ease, established a foothold, and then ran along the ramparts to attack the main gate from the inside. They slaughtered the surprised guards, threw the gate open, and the main Roman army poured into the city. The capture of New Carthage was a strategic masterstroke of the highest order. In a single day, Scipio had seized the enemy's treasury, their main arsenal filled with war supplies, their best harbor, and most importantly, a group of Spanish hostages that the Carthaginians had been holding to ensure the loyalty of the local tribes. Here, Scipio showed that he had learned the most important lesson from Hannibal. That war was not just about winning battles, but about winning hearts and minds. Instead of slaughtering the inhabitants, he showed calculated clemency. He treated the captured Spanish hostages with the utmost respect. He gathered them together, assured them of their safety, and then, in a gesture of incredible political magnanimity, he set them all free to return to their families and tribes, asking for nothing in return but their friendship. The effect was electric. The Spanish chieftains, who had served the Carthaginians out of fear, were now won over by an act of Roman grace. Tribe after tribe began to abandon the Carthaginian cause and declare their allegiance to Scipio. He was dismantling the Barcid Empire not with the sword, but with kindness. He was beating Hannibal at his own game. The student had not only learned the master's lessons, he was beginning to surpass them. Scipio's brilliant campaign in Spain was more than a series of Roman victories. It was a dagger pointed at the heart of Hannibal's entire war effort. His brother, Hasdrubal Barca, was now trapped. He was losing control of Spain, his power base crumbling under Scipio's combination of military pressure and political generosity. He knew he could not defeat Scipio in the long run. At the same time, he was receiving desperate messages from his brother in Italy, pleading for the reinforcements that were Hannibal's only path to ultimate victory. Hasdrubal was forced to make a desperate gamble. In 208 BC, deciding to abandon Spain to its fate, he gathered the remainder of his army and began his own epic march to Italy. His journey was a testament to the trail his older brother had blazed a decade earlier. Hasdrubal's crossing of the Alps was far faster and less costly than Hannibal's. The mountain passes were now known. The Gallic tribes, who had once been hostile, were now either allied with the Carthaginian cause or cowed into submission. He emerged into northern Italy in the spring of 207 BC with a fresh, powerful army of around 30,000 men. For the first time, Rome faced the nightmare scenario it had always dreaded: two sons of the Thunderbolt, two Barcid armies, on Italian soil. If their forces were to unite, no army Rome could field would be able to stop them. The fate of the Republic hung by a thread. Rome responded with grim determination, electing two of its best commanders as consuls. One, Marcus Livius, was sent north to block Hasdrubal's advance. The other, Gaius Claudius Nero, was sent south, tasked with the most dangerous job in the world: keeping Hannibal himself pinned down in Apulia and preventing him from marching north to meet his brother. The entire war had become a desperate race against time. Hasdrubal, now in Italy, needed to coordinate with his brother. He dispatched 6 messengers, 4 Gallic horsemen and 2 Numidians, to carry a letter to Hannibal, detailing his position and proposing a meeting point in Umbria. This letter was perhaps the single most important document of the entire war. The messengers made their way down the length of Italy, successfully bypassing the main Roman armies. But as they neared Hannibal's position, they got lost and were captured by a small Roman foraging party. They were brought before the consul, Claudius Nero. Under torture, they revealed their mission and handed over the letter. In his tent that night, Nero read Hasdrubal's entire plan. He was faced with a terrifying choice. His orders were to keep Hannibal contained. To leave his post would be a catastrophic breach of discipline that could see him executed. But he knew that if he did nothing, the 2 Carthaginian armies would unite, and Rome would be lost. In that moment, Nero made one of the boldest and most audacious decisions in Roman history. A move worthy of Hannibal himself. He decided to break every rule. Leaving the bulk of his army in camp with orders to maintain the illusion that he was still there, Nero handpicked 7,000 of his best troops, a small elite strike force. He told no one of his true plan, announcing only that he was leading a small raid. Then, under the cover of darkness, he marched north as fast as humanly possible. For over a week, Nero's column force-marched hundreds of miles in a desperate race north, a river of silent, determined men moving through the Italian night. They were fed and cheered on by the local towns, who understood that the fate of their world was at stake. Nero's force arrived at the camp of his colleague, Marcus Livius, in the middle of the night, slipping inside undetected by the enemy. The next morning, when Hasdrubal's army prepared for battle, their scouts reported something deeply unsettling. The Roman army facing them seemed larger than before. They heard 2 trumpet calls from the consul's tent, not one, indicating both consuls were present. Hasdrubal, a veteran commander, understood immediately. His plans had been discovered. He was facing the combined might of 2 consular armies. He had lost the element of surprise and was now dangerously outnumbered. He tried to retreat that night, but his local guides deserted him, and his army became bogged down and disordered on the banks of the Metaurus River. The next day, the Romans caught him. The Battle of the Metaurus was a brutal, one-sided affair. Hasdrubal was trapped, his army disorganized. He fought with the courage and desperation of a cornered lion, but the outcome was never in doubt. Seeing that all was lost, Hannibal Barca, son of Hamilcar and brother of Hannibal, spurred his horse and charged alone into the heart of a Roman legion, fighting until he was cut down. He died as he had lived, a soldier to the last. Nero's work, however, was not finished. He ordered his men to find Hasdrubal's body. They severed the head, and Nero immediately began his race back to the south. He arrived back at his camp just 6 days later, having been gone less than 2 weeks. Hannibal had not even noticed he was gone. The first sign that something had changed came when a group of Roman cavalry rode up to the Carthaginian outposts. They did not attack. Instead, they threw a heavy cloth-wrapped object into the camp. When Hannibal's soldiers unwrapped it, they found the severed, decomposing head of his brother, Hasdrubal. A short time later, Hannibal's Carthaginian prisoners were returned to him, and they told him the full story of the disaster at the Metaurus. Polybius tells us that Hannibal, looking upon the face of his dead brother, finally understood. His last hope was gone. Now, he is said to have uttered in quiet despair, "I see the fate of Carthage." The news of the Metaurus crushed Hannibal's spirit, but it did not end the war. For 4 more years, he remained in the southernmost part of Italy, a cornered lion, too dangerous to attack directly, but now strategically irrelevant. The main theater of war had shifted. Scipio, having completely conquered Spain, returned to Rome a national hero. He then proposed a daring final move to end the war, a direct invasion of Africa. It was a strategy fraught with risk, and the old guard of the Senate, led by Fabius Maximus, argued fiercely against it. They were terrified of sending Rome's last veteran army overseas while Hannibal was still on Italian soil. But Scipio's prestige was unstoppable. He was granted permission to raise an army and take the fight to Carthage's doorstep. In 204 BC, Scipio landed in North Africa. His presence ignited a firestorm. He immediately forged a crucial alliance with Massinissa, a brilliant Numidian prince and a bitter rival of the Carthaginians. This alliance was a strategic masterstroke. It gave Scipio what Rome had always lacked, a force of elite Numidian cavalry, the very weapon that had been the key to Hannibal's greatest victories. Now that weapon was turned against its former masters. Scipio and Massinissa began winning battle after battle, routing Carthaginian armies and threatening the city itself. The panicked government in Carthage saw only one man who could save them. They sent a desperate summons to their greatest son, the man they had undersupported for over a decade. In 203 BC, after 15 years of continuous warfare on Italian soil, Hannibal Barca was recalled to defend his homeland. He had never been defeated in a major battle in Italy, yet he was forced to abandon his life's quest. As his ships pulled away from the coast, Livy writes that he looked back with tears of rage and frustration, cursing the politicians and gods who had denied him his ultimate prize. The stage was set for the final confrontation. In 202 BC, on a flat plain near the town of Zama, the 2 greatest generals of the age met for the first and last time. Hannibal's army was a mixed bag. He had a core of his hardened veterans from the Italian campaign, his old guard, whom he placed in his third and final line. But the rest of his force consisted of raw mercenaries and hastily levied Carthaginian citizens. His one great hope was a force of over 80 war elephants, which he placed at the very front, intending to shatter the Roman legions with a terrifying opening charge. But Scipio, the diligent student, was ready. He had studied how to counter elephants. Instead of arranging his maniples in the usual checkerboard formation, he organized them in straight columns, leaving wide lanes running through his entire army. When Hannibal's elephants charged, they were funneled down these corridors. Roman skirmishers harassed them from the sides with javelins and, more effectively, by blowing huge, terrifying blasts on their war horns. The noise drove many of the animals mad with panic. Some turned and crashed back into Hannibal's own cavalry, sowing chaos. The rest simply thundered harmlessly through the lanes and out the back of the Roman formation. Hannibal's trump card had been played, and it had failed. Then, the battle unfolded like a mirror image of Cannae. Scipio's superior Roman and Numidian cavalry, led by his friend Laelius and the brilliant Massinissa, charged on the flanks. They shattered the weaker Carthaginian cavalry, and just as Hannibal's horsemen had done at Cannae, they pursued them off the field. The infantry lines then crashed together in a brutal, grinding fight. Hannibal's first 2 lines of mercenaries and citizens eventually broke and fell back. The final, desperate struggle came when Scipio's legions met Hannibal's undefeated old guard. It was a clash of the best soldiers in the world, and for a long time the outcome hung in the balance. And then the final act played out. Just as the battle reached its climax, Scipio's and Massinissa's cavalry returned from their pursuit. They did not stop. They wheeled their horses and crashed with devastating force into the rear of Hannibal's veterans. the tactic that Hannibal had perfected, the hammer and anvil encirclement that had won him his greatest victory, was now used against him. His army, surrounded and attacked from all sides, was annihilated. The battle was over. The Second Punic War was lost. Hannibal himself barely managed to escape the slaughter and flee back to Carthage, a defeated man for the first time in his life. The student had used the master's own lessons to destroy him. The peace treaty Rome imposed on Carthage was brutal. It stripped the city of its overseas empire, destroyed its war fleet, and imposed a crippling silver indemnity that would take 50 years to pay. The Second Punic War was over. For most men, this would have been the end of their story. But Hannibal was not most men. Defeated on the battlefield, he returned to Carthage and proved that his genius was not limited to warfare. He seamlessly transitioned from general to statesman. The same corrupt oligarchy that had undermined him throughout the war still controlled the state, enriching themselves while the city starved. Hannibal, elected to the city's highest office of Safit, or chief magistrate, declared war on this internal rot. With the same energy he had used to plan battles, he launched a series of radical political and financial reforms. He unmasked the embezzlement of the ruling elite, proving that they had been stealing enough public funds to pay the Roman indemnity themselves. He passed laws that broke their political power and made the government more accountable to the people. In a feat of administrative brilliance, he reorganized the state's finances so effectively that Carthage was able to pay its annual tribute to Rome without imposing any new taxes on its citizens. He was as brilliant a reformer as he was a general, and the common people loved him for it. But his success earned him powerful enemies. The corrupt aristocrats whose power he had broken hated him with a passion. They saw his popularity and his reforms as a greater threat than Rome itself. So they did what cowards have always done. They sent a message to their former enemies. They secretly informed the Roman Senate that Hannibal was not a peaceful statesman, but a warmonger, secretly plotting a new war and conspiring with Rome's latest adversary, King Antiochus III of the powerful Seleucid Empire in the east. For Rome, this was the perfect pretext. They had never been comfortable with the idea of their greatest enemy living freely. In 195 BC, a Roman delegation arrived in Carthage, demanding that the government arrest Hannibal and hand him over. Hannibal knew his own people would betray him to save themselves. That night, before the order for his arrest could be given, he slipped out of the city he had fought so hard to save and began the final tragic chapter of his life, the life of an exile. He found refuge, as his enemies had accused, at the court of King Antiochus. He became the king's chief military advisor, urging him to strike at Rome immediately and decisively. He proposed a grand strategy. Give him a small fleet and an army, and he would land once more in Italy, raising the banner of rebellion a second time. But Antiochus was an arrogant and mediocre king, suspicious of the legendary general's fame. He ignored Hannibal's advice, gave him no meaningful command, and blundered into a war that he subsequently lost to the Romans. One of the key terms of the peace treaty was predictable. Antiochus had to surrender Hannibal. Once again, Hannibal fled, now a fugitive hunted across the entire Mediterranean. The Roman shadow stretched long, and its memory was unforgiving. He wandered from kingdom to kingdom, finding temporary shelter in Crete and Armenia, a living legend with no home. His final sanctuary was at the court of King Prusias of Bithynia, in modern-day Turkey. Even here, in his old age, his military mind remained as sharp as ever. Commanding Prusias's small fleet in a war against a Roman ally, he won a brilliant naval victory by ordering his sailors to launch clay pots filled with venomous snakes onto the decks of the enemy ships, causing chaos and panic. But Rome's reach was inescapable. In 183 BC, a Roman envoy arrived at Prusias's court and delivered the final ultimatum: hand over Hannibal. The Bithynian king, too weak to refuse the republic, agreed. Roman soldiers were dispatched, and they surrounded Hannibal's villa. Looking out and seeing that all escape routes were cut off, the 64-year-old Hannibal knew the chase was finally over. He had no intention of being paraded through the streets of Rome in a triumph, a final humiliation for his enemies to gloat over. For years, he had carried a vial of poison, concealed within a ring, for just this moment. Taking the poison, he is said to have uttered his last words: "Let us now relieve the Romans of their great anxiety, since they cannot wait for the death of an old man." He died as he had lived, on his own terms, in defiance of Rome to the very last. By a strange twist of fate, his great rival and victor, Scipio Africanus, died in the same year, also in self-imposed exile, disillusioned by the politics of the very city he had saved. The age of giants was over. Hannibal's death in a lonely villa in Bithynia was a quiet end to a life of thunder. With him died the last great hope of Carthage. The city he had tried to save survived for another generation, but it was a shadow of its former self, a neutered state living under the constant, watchful eye of Rome. Eventually, even that was not enough. In 149 BC, on the flimsiest of pretexts, a deeply vindictive Roman Senate declared a third and final war. It was not a war. It was an extermination. After a heroic 3-year siege, the city of Carthage fell in 146 BC. What followed was an act of calculated cultural genocide. The city was systematically demolished, its buildings torn down stone by stone. The survivors were sold into slavery. Roman legend claims the fields were then plowed and sown with salt, a curse to ensure that nothing would ever grow there again. The dream of Hamilcar, the oath of Hannibal, and the civilization of Carthage were all turned to dust and ashes. On the surface, Hannibal's life was a catastrophic failure. He had dedicated his entire existence to a single goal, the humbling of Rome, and had failed to achieve it. He won every battle but lost the war. His homeland was ultimately erased from the earth. By any rational measure, his was a story of tragedy. But the true legacy of a historical figure is often found not in what they achieved, but in the changes they forced upon their enemies. And in this, Hannibal's legacy is unparalleled. He was Rome's greatest nemesis, but he was also its most important, if unwilling, teacher. The Roman army that marched out of Italy to conquer Greece, Gaul, and the entire Mediterranean was not the same rigid, predictable army that Hannibal had butchered at Cannae. It was a more flexible, more professional, and far more lethal fighting force. And it was Hannibal who had been its ghostly instructor. He had taught the Romans the importance of combined arms tactics, the necessity of skilled cavalry, the art of strategy, and the value of studying one's opponent. Scipio Africanus was his first and most brilliant student, but the lessons were learned by the entire Roman military establishment. The professional legions of Caesar, the armies that built the Roman Empire, were the direct descendants of the force that had been forged and tempered in the crucible of the Second Punic War. By trying to destroy Rome's army, Hannibal had inadvertently perfected it. He changed Rome politically as well. The 15 years he spent on Italian soil were a trial by fire that burned away the last vestiges of the old republic's weaknesses. The war unified Italy under Roman leadership in a way no peaceful diplomacy ever could. It professionalized its command structure and hardened its political will. The state that emerged from the war was no longer just the dominant power in Italy. It was a true superpower, with the military and psychological fortitude to impose its will on the entire known world. In his attempt to break the Republic, Hannibal had unintentionally laid the foundations for the empire. And so, who was Hannibal Barca? He was arguably the finest battlefield commander in human history. His victory at Cannae remains the benchmark for tactical perfection, studied in military academies to this very day. He was a tragic figure, a man of singular genius and unbreakable will, who dedicated his life to a vow made as a child, only to be undermined by his own people and ultimately defeated by an enemy that learned to imitate him. But above all, He is a symbol of the power of a single individual to bend the course of history. For 15 years, one man, driven by intellect and an all-consuming hatred, held the most powerful nation on earth in a state of terror. His story is the eternal testament that even against the greatest of odds, the will of a single determined mind can challenge empires and shape the destiny of the world. The shadow he cast was long, and in that shadow Rome, his most hated enemy, grew into the greatest empire the world would ever know.